Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. There's a village in Suffolk that time, by all appearances, forgot to change. It sits in the gentle folds of the wool country, some 6 miles from Sudbury, and perhaps 10 from Bury St. Edmunds. In that part of England where the land is so flat and so wide and so given over to sky that the horizon seems not a boundary but an invitation, a long, low, open suggestion that the world continues in every direction without particular urgency or interruption. The fields around it are the colour of old linen in autumn, and the colour of cold pewter in winter, and the colour of something between green and gold in the brief weeks when spring finally arrives. And they have been this colour, or very nearly this colour, for so many centuries that the colour itself seems less a property of the fields than a property of time, the particular tint that accumulates on a landscape when enough years have passed and enough seasons have turned and enough people have looked at it and found it sufficient. The village is called Lavenham. You may find it on any map of Suffolk, and if you drive there today, though driving is not the recommended approach, the lanes being narrow and the village being the kind of place that reveals itself most fully to those who arrive slowly and on foot, you will find that it looks, in most of the ways that matter, very much as it looked in the autumn of 1887, when this story begins. The houses are the first thing you will notice. They are timber framed, most of them, built in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Lavenham was one of the wealthiest towns in England, wealthier at its height than many cities. Its prosperity founded entirely on wool and the cloth that wool became in the hands of its weavers. The frames of these houses are oak, ancient oak, and over the centuries the oak has done what oak does when left to itself and subjected to the patient pressure of time. It has twisted and settled and leaned and developed the particular character that only very old wood possesses, the character of something that has accommodated a great deal without being broken by any of it. The walls between the frames are plaster, and the plaster is painted, pink and cream, and a particular shade of ochre that has no precise name, but which is the colour of warm candlelight translated into pigment. And the overall effect of a street of these houses, seen in the low light of a November afternoon, is of something that exists at the intersection of the architectural and the natural, something that has been built by human hands but has since been adopted by time as one of its own. The streets are narrow and the surfaces are old, not cobblestone exactly, but worn, compressed, intimate surfaces that carry the record of centuries of use in their every irregularity. They slope slightly in unexpected directions, following the land's own reasoning rather than any surveyor's logic, and they turn at angles that are never quite right angles, producing at each corner a small visual surprise, a new composition of timber and plaster and sky that you had not anticipated, and that rewards the kind of attention most people do not know they are capable of until a place like this demands it of them. The church of St. Peter and St. Paul stands at the high end of the village, if high is the right word, for an elevation of perhaps 30 feet above the market square. And it is enormous, magnificently and slightly absurdly enormous for a village of this size. Its tower visible for miles across the flat Suffolk countryside, its interior vast and cool and lit by the kind of light that only old stained glass produces, a light that is simultaneously warm and cold, coloured and clear, ancient and entirely present. It was built by the wool merchants in the 15th century as a declaration of their prosperity and their faith, and it has outlasted both the prosperity and, in most cases, the faith, and stands now, as it will continue to stand, patient and enormous, and entirely itself. This place is real. Every street named in this story exists. Every building described is there. If you visit Lavenham, and you should, if the opportunity presents itself, you will find Water Street, and Church Street, and the Marketplace, and the Guildhall, and the Swan Hotel, and the Priory exactly as they are described here, give or take the particular quality of the light on the particular morning of your visit. The characters, however, are not real. Frances Holt never kept a shop on Water Street. Dorothea Marsh never came to Lavenham from London in the autumn of 1887 with a single trunk and a great deal of quiet exhaustion. The conversations they had, by fires, over tea, in the early mornings on the frost-pale streets, were never spoken aloud, but everything around them was real, and is real, and will continue to be real long after this story has faded from every memory it has entered. The light on the timber frames in the late afternoon, the sound of the church bell carrying across the flat Suffolk fields, the particular smell of a wool shop in November, lanolin and old wood, and the faint sweetness of dyed cloth, the way the village looks in the first snowfall of winter, the white of the snow against the pink and cream and ochre of the plaster, the whole thing so quiet and so beautiful that it seems less like weather and more like a gift that was not expected but is received with the whole of the body. This is a story placed inside a real place, the way a pressed flower is placed inside a book. The book is real, the pages are real, and the flower, though it came from somewhere else and belongs to no page in particular, is real too, and adds something to the book that the book did not have before. You need do nothing now but settle. Let the day's business become, for a time, very far away. Let your breathing slow to its own natural rhythm, which is slower than thinking and more honest than most of what the waking hours require of us. The fire is lit. The kettle is on. The village is very quiet outside the window. Come in. Frances Holt woke, as she had woken every morning for the 11 months since Edward's death, to the sound of the church bell marking the hour. She did not know, in those first seconds, whether she had been asleep or simply lying in the darkness with her eyes closed, which was a distinction that had become, in recent months, less clear than it had once been. Sleep for Frances was no longer the clean and definitive thing it had been in the years of the marriage, the years of Edward's warm presence beside her, his slow and regular breathing, a kind of anchor that held her to the night and kept her from drifting into the anxious half-wakefulness that was her default condition when she was young and had not yet learned to trust the dark. Now, without that anchor, she moved through the night in a more provisional way, touching sleep and releasing it, and touching it again, the way a boat that has lost its mooring moves with the water rather than against it. The bell struck 6. She counted, as she always counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Not because she needed to know the hour, which she already knew, but because the counting was itself a form of attention, a small, deliberate act of being present in the dark of the bedroom on the upper floor of the house on Water Street in the village of Lavenham, in the county of Suffolk, in the year of our Lord 1887, which was the 61st year of her life, and the first year of her widowhood, and a year that had been, in ways she was still in the process of understanding, the most quietly significant year she had known. She lay in the bed, the same bed she had shared with Edward for 38 years, which she had considered replacing and had decided against, the decision being less about sentiment than about the simple fact that it was a good bed and she slept in it, and there was no rational argument for change. And looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was low, as all the ceilings in the house were low, the house being built in the 16th century for people who were, by modern standards, considerably shorter than Frances herself, and it had the particular character of very old plaster, a surface that had been painted many times over many generations until the layers of paint had become themselves a kind of history, a geological record of the house's long habitation. Outside the single window, small, leaded, its glass the slightly uneven glass of the period that produced in the light that came through it a faint distortion, a barely perceptible wavering, as though the world outside was seen through very still water. The village was beginning. She could hear it before she could see it, the sound of boots on the cold stone of the street below, someone passing early, the footsteps clear and unhurried in the still November air, a cart somewhere toward the marketplace, the crows in the churchyard beginning their morning commentary on whatever the morning offered. Frances listened to all of this with the complete, unhurried attention that had been her primary way of engaging with the world for as long as she could remember, and felt, as she felt every morning at this hour, the particular satisfaction of a world that was doing what it had always done, regardless of what the night had taken or given. She put her feet on the cold floor. She began. The house on Water Street had been in Frances's family, her mother's family, the Carters, who had been Lavenham people for longer than any of them could trace with certainty, for 4 generations, which meant that the house had been inhabited by Carters and Carter-derived people for something approaching 150 years, and which meant, in turn, that every surface in it had been worn and shaped and marked by the particular habits and requirements of the people who had lived there. The staircase, for instance, narrow, steep, turning sharply at its midpoint in the way of staircases that were designed for the dimensions of a different century, had a smooth patch on the right-hand wall at precisely the height of Frances's shoulder, worn there by generations of right hands steadying themselves on the descent, and Frances's own hand found this smooth patch every morning without her having to think about it, the motion being so deeply established in her body's memory that it occurred before any conscious intention could form. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, not because it was better insulated than the others, but because it was at the back of the house, sheltered from the east wind that came off the Suffolk plain in November, with a directness that the village's narrow streets only partially softened. It had a large iron range that Frances had learned to operate from her mother, and that her mother had learned to operate from her mother, and which had the particular character of kitchen equipment that has been in continuous and competent use for a very long time, a character of settled reliability, of being exactly what it was, and nothing more and nothing less. She lit the range with the efficiency of long practice, newspaper, kindling, the match held at the angle that always worked, the damper adjusted to the position that the range, with its particular draught and its particular character, required. The fire caught and settled and began its work. While the kettle heated, Frances stood at the kitchen window, which faced east and therefore faced the narrow strip of garden that ran behind the house, and the timber-framed garden wall, and, beyond the wall, the back gardens of the houses on the next street. At this hour, in November, there was nothing to see, only darkness and the faint shapes of the bare apple tree in the garden's corner, and the cold. But she stood at the window anyway, as she stood at it every morning, because the standing had become part of the ritual, as necessary and as sufficient as the fire and the tea. The village, outside the window and beyond the garden, was waking. She could hear it in the specific way that she had learned, over 61 years of Lavenham mornings, to hear it. The church bell, the crows, the first cart on the marketplace cobbles, the sound of a window being opened in the house 2 doors down. Old Mrs. Blackwood, who always opened her bedroom window at 6:30, regardless of the temperature, a habit she had maintained for so many years that the village had come to regard it as a kind of clock. The kettle sang. Frances made her tea. She took it to the chair by the kitchen window, a Windsor chair, wooden, worn to the colour and texture of old bone, which had been in this position beside this window for as long as Frances could remember, and which she had never considered moving because it was in the right place, which was a different thing from saying it had always been in that place, though in this case both things happened to be true. She sat and held the cup in both hands and let the warmth of it come through her palms, and looked at the garden in the dark, and drank her tea and listened to Lavenham wake. The shop opened at 8 o'clock every morning except Sunday, which was the arrangement Frances had maintained since Edward's death without alteration, because alteration in the matter of hours would have required explanation, and explanation would have required conversation, and conversation, in the first months of widowhood, had seemed to Frances a task beyond her capacity. It was not grief, precisely, that made conversation difficult. Or rather, it was grief, but not the kind that announces itself and expects sympathy. It was the quieter kind, the kind that settles into the fabric of a life the way dampness settles into old stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but thoroughly and in all directions, until the distinction between the stone and the dampness becomes difficult to maintain. Edward had been a quiet man, and their life together had been a quiet life, and what she missed was not his conversation. They had never talked very much by most standards, but the quality of the silence when he was there, the silence of a shared life is a different thing from the silence of a solitary one, even when both silences contain the same absence of words. And this difference was what Francis felt most completely in the months after his death. Not the absence of speech, but the changed quality of the quiet. The shop, Holt and Thread, as the sign above the door read, the name having been Edward's suggestion and Francis's acceptance, which was more or less the pattern their decisions had followed through 38 years of marriage, occupied the ground floor of the house's eastern wing, which had been a separate room from the domestic quarters since the house was built, and which had, in the hands of Francis's maternal grandfather, been converted into a commercial space of the modest but reliable kind. It sold wool and thread and cloth and the various small implements of needlework and weaving, needles and thimbles and bobbins and the particular kind of heavy wooden shuttle that the Lavenham weavers had used for generations. It also sold, less formally, the thing that Francis had always sold without knowing it, which was a quality of unhurried attention, a sense that whoever was in the shop at any given moment was the only person whose business mattered, which produced in customers a feeling of being genuinely seen that was, in Francis's experience, rarer and more valued than any quality of merchandise. She opened the shutters at 8 o'clock on the first morning of November and looked out at Water Street in the low grey light of a Suffolk autumn morning, and found it, as she found it, every morning, entirely itself. The familiar curve of the street, the timber-framed houses opposite, with their slightly uneven facades, the cobblestones dark with the overnight damp, the bare branches of the laburnum in the garden of the house 3 doors north, reaching over the garden wall into the street's airspace, with the unconcerned authority of something that has been doing this for a very long time. A woman was walking up the street. Francis did not recognize her. The woman walking up Water Street was not from Lavenham. Francis knew every person in Lavenham, had known them all her life, had watched the generations turn, had attended the christenings and the weddings and the funerals that marked the village's passage through time, and the particular way this woman walked, with the slightly uncertain purpose of someone navigating unfamiliar geography, confirmed what her unfamiliar face had already suggested. She was perhaps 58 years old, perhaps a year or two either side of that. She was tall, taller than Francis, who was herself not short, and she carried herself with the compressed, slightly guarded posture of a person who has spent many years in authority and has not yet entirely shed the habit, even in circumstances where authority is neither required nor available. Her coat was good quality. Francis, who had handled cloth all her life, could assess these things from a considerable distance. A dark grey wool of the kind that suggested London rather than Suffolk. She carried a single leather bag over her left shoulder and walked with the deliberate step of someone who is looking carefully at everything around her without wanting to appear to be doing so. She did not look into the shop as she passed. Francis watched her go with the mild, patient curiosity that was her characteristic response to anything unfamiliar. Not the sharp, acquisitive curiosity that some people felt toward novelty, the curiosity that needed to be satisfied immediately, but the slower and more attentive kind that understood that most things revealed themselves in time if you gave them the space to do so. She went back inside and opened the drawer beneath the counter that held the day's first task, a commission from Mrs. Alderton for 12 yards of dark blue worsted, and began the methodical work of measuring and cutting that occupied her hands while leaving her mind entirely free to do what it preferred to do, which was to observe and consider and arrive, eventually, and without urgency, and understanding. The unfamiliar woman reappeared at the top of the street an hour later, now walking in the other direction. She had apparently gone to the marketplace and was now returning. She walked more slowly this time. She looked at the houses. Once she stopped entirely and stood for a full minute, looking up at the carved wooden beam that framed the first floor of the house, directly opposite Frances's shop. A beam carved in the 16th century with the particular intertwined foliage pattern that the Lavenham craftsman had favoured, worn now to a beautiful grey-brown smoothness that made the carving look less like craft and more like natural formation. She looked at the beam the way Frances looked at things. That was what Frances noticed. Not a glance, not the brief, polite acknowledgement of the tourist who has been told something is beautiful and is performing the appropriate response. A real look. A look that was prepared to stay for as long as the thing required. Frances found this interesting. Her name, Frances learned 3 days later from Mrs. Blackwood, who knew everything about everyone in Lavenham within approximately 48 hours of its becoming knowable, was Dorothea Marsh. She had taken the rooms above the old printer's shop on Church Street, which had been vacant since the spring, and she had arrived with 1 trunk and 1 leather bag and a quantity of books that had required a second delivery from the Tsar carrier's cart, and which had apparently filled the room's single set of shelves and required the purchase of a second set from the joiner on Barn Street. "Schoolteacher," said Mrs. Blackwood, with the decisive tone of a woman delivering a verdict. Or was. Headmistress, they say. "London." "They say," Frances agreed, which was not an endorsement of the information, but a recognition that it had been offered. "Comes down for bread every morning at 7, walks the long way round, Church Street, round the Priory, back through the marketplace, every morning, same time, same way." Frances absorbed this without comment. She was standing in Mrs. Blackwood's kitchen, where she had come to deliver a skein of grey wool that Mrs. Blackwood had ordered the previous week, and she was drinking the tea that Mrs. Blackwood had insisted upon, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been insisting upon tea for 80 years and had never yet encountered a refusal she could not overcome. "Quiet woman," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "Says good morning, doesn't linger." "That seems sensible," Frances said. "New people often linger," Mrs. Blackwood observed, with the faintly disapproving tone of someone who had seen a great deal of inappropriate lingering over the years. "They want to explain themselves, where they've come from, why they're here, as if anyone's asked." "As if anyone's asked," Frances agreed. She finished her tea, thanked Mrs. Blackwood, put on her coat, and walked back to the shop through the November morning, which was cold and still and smelled of wood smoke and the particular mineral dampness of old stone in wet autumn air. She passed the bottom of Church Street and looked up it, not deliberately, simply because it was the direction her eyes moved, and saw at the top of the street near the church gate a tall figure in a dark grey coat, walking slowly, looking at things. Frances did not stop, but she noted the figure and the way it moved, and added this to the small, patient accumulation of observation that was her primary way of knowing the world. November in Lavenham was not a month that announced itself with any particular drama. It arrived, as it always arrived in Suffolk, with a quiet assumption of authority, the temperature dropping by increments too small to identify on any single day, but sufficient over the course of a week to change the quality of everything. The air, the light, the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones, the particular way that smoke rose from the chimneys of the timber-framed houses and hung in the still cold air before dispersing. Frances had lived through 61 Novembers in Lavenham, all of them since she had been born here, and had never lived anywhere else, not even for a year, not even for a month. And she had come to know November the way you know a person after a very long acquaintance, not through any single defining moment, but through the accumulated weight of many unremarkable encounters, each one adding its small increment to a knowledge that had no clear edges and no definitive form, but which was, in its depth and its completeness, something more reliable than anything more formally acquired. She knew, for instance, that the light in Lavenham in November was different from the light in any other month, and different from the November light she had seen in photographs of other places. It was not the dramatic grey of coastal November or the silvery grey of upland November. It was a warmer grey, a grey that had amber in its undertones, reflecting the plaster of the houses, which absorbed and returned the light differently from stone or brick, warming it slightly, giving it a quality that was neither quite warm nor quite cold, but which had its own specific character that Frances had never been able to describe precisely, and had stopped trying to describe, accepting it instead as one of the things she simply knew. She walked the village every afternoon at 3 o'clock when the shop was quietest, and she could leave it in the care of young Ada Moss, who was 17 and entirely competent, and who regarded the responsibility with a seriousness that Frances found both admirable and slightly touching. On the 5th of November, she walked down Church Street and saw Dorothea Marsh coming out of the baker's with a wrapped loaf under her arm. Their eyes met for a moment. Dorothea nodded. Frances nodded. Neither stopped, but something had passed between them in the exchange of those nods, some acknowledgement, some recognition that they existed in the same village, and that this existence was not threatening to either of them, that Frances carried home with her and thought about briefly while she made her supper. The shop was, as Frances had always understood it to be, the place where the village's life came to rest for a moment before continuing. People did not come to Holt and Thread only for wool and thread, though they came for those too. They came because the shop had a quality of stillness that was difficult to find elsewhere in the ordinary run of a day, a quality that had nothing to do with the goods it sold and everything to do with the woman who sold them. Frances had never done anything deliberate to produce this quality. She did not make a particular effort to be welcoming or warm or available. She did what she had always done. She paid attention. When a person came into the shop, she looked at them, really looked, not the quick assessing look of the shopkeeper calculating a sale. but the slower, fuller look of someone genuinely interested in what was there. She asked about what needed to be asked about and did not ask about what did not need to be asked about. She listened. She allowed silences to exist without filling them. The result, over many years, was that people told her things in the shop that they did not tell anyone else. Not secrets usually, not confessions or revelations, but the quieter things, the small worries and the small pleasures and the observations about the world that people carried around with them, waiting for a moment in which they could be shared without embarrassment. Frances received these things with the same attention she gave to everything, and they accumulated in her, not as a burden, but as a kind of knowledge, a texture of understanding of the village and its people that was, she thought, among the most valuable things she possessed. On the 8th of November, a Wednesday, she was measuring out a length of cream flannel for Mrs. Thorpe's new nightgowns when the shop bell rang and the door opened to admit a breath of cold November air, and, following it, the woman in the grey coat. Dorothea Marsh stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the shop with the careful, attentive look that Frances had already identified as her characteristic mode of engaging with new things. She looked at the shelves of wool, arranged by colour in the gradations that Frances maintained with the instinctive care of someone for whom colour was a form of language. She looked at the wooden counter with its worn surface and its brass scale and its neat arrangement of small tools. She looked at Frances. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was measured and quiet, with the careful diction of someone who had spent many years speaking to rooms full of people who needed to hear every word. "Good morning," Frances said, and continued measuring the flannel because Mrs. Thorpe was waiting and the flannel needed to be measured, and because she had found, over many years, that the best way to allow people to enter a space comfortably was to continue doing what you were doing rather than stopping everything to attend to them, which tended to produce a kind of performance of arrival that was useful to no one. Dorothea came in. She closed the door behind her. She began quietly and without fuss to look at the wool. She bought a skein of dark blue wool. She chose it herself, standing at the shelves for several minutes with the focused deliberation of someone making a decision that mattered to them, though the decision was only about wool. Frances watched her choose, not intrusively, not with the shopkeeper's anxious hovering, but with the peripheral attention she brought to everything that happened in the shop, the attention that registered without interfering. Dorothea's hands, when she took the skein from the shelf and held it up to examine the colour in the light from the window, were the hands of someone who had worked, not physically, not the roughened hands of outdoor work or manual labour, but worked in the way the constant use of the mind and the will produces its own kind of marking. They were steady hands. She held the wool as she had looked at the carved beam on Water Street, and as she had looked at the shop, with the quality of attention that takes time. "This one," she said, and brought it to the counter. Frances weighed it, wrapped it, told her the price. Dorothea paid without comment. She put the wool in her bag. She looked at Frances again, the same direct, unhurried look. "You are Mrs. Holt," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Frances said. "I am Dorothea Marsh. I've taken the rooms on Church Street." A pause. I wanted to introduce myself properly. Frances looked at her, really looked, in the way that she looked at things, and found what she usually found when she looked carefully at people. A great deal more than the surface presented. Dorothea Marsh was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour of the day. She was guarded in a way that had become so habitual that she was probably no longer aware of it. And underneath both of these things, the tiredness and the guardedness, there was something else, something that Frances did not yet have a name for, but which she recognized as the kind of thing that brought people to small Suffolk villages in late autumn with one trunk and a great many books. "How do you find the rooms?" Frances asked. "Cold," Dorothea said, "but good bones." Frances found that she was almost smiling. Frances walked to the church every Sunday morning. She had done this since childhood, had sat in the same pew, fourth from the front on the left side, that her family had occupied for as long as anyone could remember. And she continued to do it now, not because she was, in any strictly examined sense, a devout woman, but because the Sunday morning walk through the village and the hour in the vast, cool interior of the church provided her with something she found it difficult to obtain in any other way, a quality of stillness that was not her own stillness, but a stillness that had accumulated in a place over many centuries of use, a stillness that she could enter the way you enter a room that is already at the right temperature, the warmth not of your making, and not requiring anything from you except your presence. On the second Sunday of November, she walked up Church Street in the pale grey morning and found two pews behind her habitual one, Dorothea Marsh. She had not seen her in the church before. She did not acknowledge her. Neither did Dorothea, though Frances was aware, with the peripheral certainty she trusted entirely, that Dorothea had seen her. The service proceeded in the way that Suffolk church services had proceeded for generations, with a thoroughness that was not hurried and a dignity that was not elaborate. The words of the Book of Common Prayer having been said in this building for so many centuries, that they had acquired something of the building's own quality, the quality of things that have been present in a place for a very long time and have become, through that long presence, part of the place itself. Afterward, in the churchyard, Frances stood for a moment by Edward's grave. It was a simple stone. She had chosen it herself without fuss, and it bore his name and his dates, and the single line she had selected from the many possibilities available to her. He was a quiet man, and his silence was a gift. She had thought, at the time of choosing it, that it might seem an insufficient memorial. She had come to understand, in the months since, that it was the most precise and the most honest thing she could have said, and that precision and honesty were worth more than elaboration. She was turning to leave when she became aware of Dorothea Marsh standing a few feet away, not near Edward's grave. She was standing near the old section of the churchyard, the section where the stones were so old and so weathered that the names on them had long since become illegible, and she was looking at one of these stones with the same quiet, extended attention she brought to everything. Frances did not speak, neither did Dorothea, but they walked out of the churchyard gate at the same moment, their footsteps on the gravel path falling into an accidental rhythm, and they walked down Church Street together in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. At the bottom of the street, where it met Water Street, they separated without words. A nod from Dorothea, returned by Frances, and went their different ways. The notebook in which Frances recorded her observations was a plain thing. Brown cloth cover, marbled end papers, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges from the years it had spent on the shelf beside her reading chair. She had been keeping similar notebooks since she was 23 years old, which meant that she had, in the 40 years since, filled approximately 17 of them, each one shelved in the order of its completion in the small bookcase beside the sitting-room window. She did not keep a diary in any conventional sense. She did not record her moods or her opinions or the events of her days in any sequential narrative. What the notebooks contained was something closer to what a naturalist might record, observations of the world as it presented itself to her on any given day, entered with the care and the precision of a person who understood that the things most worth preserving were the ones that would otherwise be lost entirely, the ones too small and too quiet to survive without someone taking the deliberate trouble to notice them. On the evening of the 9th of November, she sat in the reading chair by the sitting-room fire, which was a good coal fire, generous, the kind she had always maintained in the evenings through the winter months, because warmth was one of the things she had decided some years ago not to economize on, and opened the notebook to a new page and wrote, November. The village has settled into its winter self with the usual quiet efficiency. The plane tree on the marketplace has lost all but a dozen leaves. By the week's end, they will be gone. The light this afternoon at 4 o'clock had the particular quality it achieves in mid-November, warmer than it should be given the temperature, the plaster of the houses receiving it and returning it in the amber range. Mrs. B reports a new arrival. Church Street, former headmistress, London. Has been in the shop once. Bought dark blue wool, chose it carefully. Her hands, when she held the skein, steady, considered. Her manner, guarded but not unkind. There is something in her of the quality of a room that has been closed for some time and is just beginning to be opened. The air not yet fully exchanged, the temperature not yet quite itself, but the process clearly underway. She closed the notebook and looked at the fire for some time, thinking about what she had written and whether it was accurate, which was her habitual response to anything she had committed to words. She decided it was approximately accurate, which was the best she usually hoped for. Dorothea Marsh came into the shop on the 12th of November, and then again on the 15th, and then on the 19th. She did not always buy something. On the 15th, she came in, looked at the new delivery of green wool that Frances had arranged on the south shelf that morning, said, "The green is very fine," and left. On the 19th, she bought 3 skeins of grey and stood at the counter while Frances wrapped them and asked, without looking up from the wool, "How long have you been here?" "All my life," Frances said. "I was born in this house." Dorothea was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And the shop?" "My grandfather's, then my mother's, then mine. You never wanted to leave." It was not quite a question. Frances considered it as though it were. "I wanted other things," she said, finally. "Not to leave. The village was always part of what I was. Leaving it would have been like leaving part of myself." She paused. "That sounds sentimental." "It doesn't," Dorothea said. Her voice had a particular quality in saying this, a flatness that was not dismissal but its opposite, a deliberate removal of irony, a statement made without qualification or hedging. It sounds accurate. Frances looked at her. Dorothea looked back. There was a quality in the look, brief, direct, and then released. The way you release something you have been holding carefully. That Frances filed alongside the steady hands and the careful choosing of wool, and the way she had stood in the churchyard looking at the illegible stones. "Will you take tea?" Frances said. This was not her invariable offer. She did not offer tea to everyone who came into the shop. She offered it to the people for whom the shop was not only a place to buy wool, and she had a reliable instinct for which people these were. Dorothea looked at her for a moment and then said, "Yes, thank you." They drank their tea in the small back room that served as Frances's workroom, and, on occasion, as a place of conversation for the people she invited into it. It was a room of modest dimensions and considerable character. The shelves held not only the overflow stock of the shop, but also the accumulated tools and materials of Frances's own weaving, which she did in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons on the small loom that stood against the east wall, a loom that had been her mother's, and before that her grandmother's, and that she maintained with the same attentive care she brought to everything she used over a long period. The stove was small but efficient. It heated the back room to a warmth that was considerably more intimate than the shop's more restrained temperature, and the two women sat beside it with their tea and the particular quality of silence that exists between people who have not yet established the terms of their acquaintance, but who have each, independently, decided that the acquaintance is worth establishing. Dorothea spoke first. "I was a headmistress for 22 years, she said. A school in Islington. Girls, 12 to 16. Some of them came from good families. Most did not." She held her cup in both hands, the same gesture Frances noticed that she herself used, the gesture of someone who wants the warmth in the palms as well as the warmth in the throat. "I was good at it, I think. The school was better when I left than when I arrived, which is the only real measure." "And why did you leave?" Frances asked. Not intrusively. The question arose naturally from the shape of what Dorothea had said, and Frances asked it in the tone of someone who is genuinely interested in the answer and will receive whatever answer is given with equal equanimity. "Because I had been doing it for 22 years, Dorothea said, "and I had forgotten how to do anything else. And then my husband." She paused. The pause had the quality of someone choosing their words not for effect, but for accuracy. "My husband made a different choice about his life, and I found that the school, which I had used as a reason not to examine certain things, could no longer serve that purpose." Frances did not ask what the different choice had been. She understood from the phrasing that it had been the kind of choice that people made a great deal of effort not to make explicitly clear, and that this effort was itself a form of information. "So you came to Lavenham," Frances said. "I saw a photograph in a book about Suffolk, the marketplace in the snow." Dorothea looked into her cup. It looked like a place where things could be simple. "It is simple," Frances said, "but not in the way photographs suggest. It is simple in the way that very old things are simple, because they have been reduced over time, to what they essentially are. Dorothea looked at her. This look was different from the previous ones. More open, less guarded. The look of someone who has just heard something that has arrived exactly where it was needed. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." After Dorothea left, Frances sat in the back room for a few minutes before returning to the shop. She was in the habit of doing this after conversations that had required more than ordinary attention, sitting in the residue of the exchange, as it were, before moving on to whatever came next. She thought about what Dorothea had said about the photograph, about a place where things could be simple. She thought about all the people who had come to Lavenham over the years with some version of this idea, the idea that an old place, a beautiful old place, could provide a simplicity that their ordinary lives did not contain. Some of them had found what they were looking for and stayed. More of them had found that what the village offered was not simplicity in the sense they had meant, which was usually the absence of difficulty, but simplicity in the sense of clarity, the thing stripped down to what it was, the pattern made visible by the removal of everything that was not the pattern. This was a different kind of simplicity, and it required more of a person, not less. She thought about Dorothea's hands around the teacup, the same gesture she used herself. This was not a small thing. People who held their cups in both hands were people who wanted the warmth and were willing to acknowledge wanting it, which was not everyone. She thought about the phrase, "My husband made a different choice," the precision of it, the deliberate flatness, the way it had been said to her and not to anyone else, which was a form of trust, not the trust of intimacy, not yet, but the preliminary trust of one careful person recognizing another careful person and deciding that care deserved care. She rose, straightened her dress, and went back into the shop. Ada Moss was at the counter, serving Mrs. Alderton's sister with an expression of composed competence that Frances found quietly admirable. The shop smelled of wool and lamp oil, and the faint wood smoke drifting through the window from some nearby chimney. The November afternoon outside was deepening toward the particular early dark of the month, that dark which arrived by 4:30 and which Frances had always found not depressing but useful, a reminder that the day had its own shape and that the evening, with its fire and its lamp and its quiet, was a distinct and valuable portion of it. She went to the window and looked at Water Street, a few figures moving in the grey afternoon. The plane tree at the street's top corner, its last 3 leaves visible against the pale sky, holding on with the patient determination of things that have not yet decided to let go. She watched one of the leaves detach and fall, turning slowly in the still air, and thought about what it meant to hold on and what it meant to release, which were questions she had been thinking about, in one form or another, for 11 months. In the 3rd week of November, the weather changed in the way that Suffolk weather changes in the 3rd week of November, without drama, without announcement, with simply the slow arrival of something colder and more definitive than what had come before. The temperature dropped below freezing for the first time overnight on the 21st, and the cobblestones of Water Street were pale and slightly glittering in the early morning when Frances opened the shutters. She stood in the shop doorway in her coat for a moment before the day began, breathing the cold air and looking at the street. The cold had the particular quality of the first real cold of the season, sharper than the cold that had preceded it, more honest, as though the temperature had finally committed to what it had been approaching for weeks and was now simply and fully itself. The plane tree at the corner had lost its last leaves overnight. The branches were entirely bare, reaching against the pale sky with the same clarity that the cold had given to everything else. Frances looked at the bare branches and found them, as she always found the November branches of familiar trees, more legible than the same branches in leaf, the tree's actual structure visible now, the lines of it clear and unambiguous against the sky. She had been thinking about Dorothea Marsh in the way she thought about things she found interesting, not deliberately, not with any particular intention, but in the background of other thoughts, the way a tune runs through the mind while the hands are doing something else. She had been thinking about what it would be like to arrive in a place at the age of 58, having spent 22 years being responsible for an institution, the particular kind of emptiness that would follow that kind of fullness. She had arrived at something that was approximately understanding, but was not quite that, more like the beginning of the shape of understanding, the outline of it. She found that she was, quietly and without urgency, interested in what else might be inside the outline. Dorothea appeared at the top of Water Street at 7:15, as she did every morning. Frances had established this fact through the window observation of several days, because it was the kind of fact she established without thinking much about the process of establishing it. She was walking at her usual pace, which had, Frances noticed, slowed fractionally from the pace of her first days in the village. Not a dramatic slowing, but perceptible to the kind of attention Frances habitually brought. The cold had clearly arrived at Dorothea as well. She had added a dark wool scarf to the grey coat, and her collar was turned up, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She walked with the slight forward lean of someone moving into cold rather than through it, which was the characteristic posture of people who were not, by temperament, cold weather people. Frances thought, she will get used to it. Then she thought, she is getting used to it already. On the 24th of November, a Saturday, Dorothea came into the shop in the mid-afternoon carrying, in addition to her bag, a book, a large cloth-bound volume that she set on the counter while she looked at the wool. Frances looked at the book. It was a history of Suffolk wool towns, published by a Cambridge press some 15 years previously. The spine was worn, the pages slightly splayed. It had been read, and not for the first time. "You've been researching," Frances said. Dorothea looked up from the wool. "I've been reading," she said, with the slight distinction of a person who did not consider reading and research to be the same activity. There's a difference. Research has an aim. Reading goes where it goes. And where did it go? Dorothea was quiet for a moment, her fingers resting on a skein of deep ochre wool. "It went to the weavers," she said, "the 15th century weavers who built this village, the Spring family, the Branch family, the money they made and what they did with it." She paused. "They built the church," she said, with the tone of someone who has found something genuinely surprising. "The whole church, paid for almost entirely by 2 families, because they could, and because they wanted to," Frances said. That's what my mother always said. They could have built a smaller one. They chose the large one. Why? Frances thought about this, not performing thought, actually thinking. Because they understood that the building would outlast them, she said, finally, that the size of it would still be there when they were gone, that it would be there when everyone had forgotten their names. The building would remain as evidence that something very large had been felt, even if the person who felt it was no longer there to describe it. Dorothea looked at her. The look had the quality of someone encountering an idea that has arrived exactly at the moment when it was needed. Yes, she said, that is exactly it. She bought the ochre wool. She left the book on the counter by accident, or what appeared to be accident. Frances put it aside and returned it to her the following Monday, and found, in the exchange, that both of them understood it had not been an accident. December came to Lavenham with a particular quality of cold that was specific to this part of Suffolk. Not the wet cold of the coast, nor the sharp cold of higher ground, but a dry, still penetrating cold that came off the flat fields to the east and settled into the village's narrow streets and stayed there, contained by the timber frames and the plaster walls, concentrating itself in the alleys between the houses and in the low spots of the cobblestone lanes, where the frost collected most faithfully. Frances had lived through 61 December mornings in Lavenham, and she walked into each one with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, finding in each one what she always found, the village being its most essential self, stripped of the softness that the longer light of the other seasons imposed, showing its structure and its character with the directness that cold and bare branches and early dark invariably produced. She opened the shop on the 1st of December at 8 o'clock and stood for a moment in the doorway, as she had stood on the 1st of November, and looked at Water Street. The cold was absolute and immediate. The cobblestones were white with frost. The plane tree at the corner was a study in bare precision. Every branch, every twig, every joint and bifurcation clearly legible against the white sky. She breathed in the cold air and thought, December. It was not a thought that required elaboration. December was a fact, and she received it as she received all facts, with attention and without resistance. Inside the shop, Ada had already lit the oil lamp. She arrived before Frances most mornings now, and performed these small preparatory acts with a quiet efficiency that Frances valued more than she would have known how to articulate. The lamp's amber light filled the shop with its characteristic warmth. The smell of the shop in winter was different from its smell in the other seasons. The lanolin in the wool took on a slightly different quality in cold air, warmer and more present, and the old wood of the shelves and the counter released a faint resinous note that it withheld in warmer months. Frances went to the back room and put the kettle on. It occurred to her, while she waited for it to boil, that she had not spoken to Dorothea Marsh in 4 days, the longest gap since the 19th of November. She found this observation interesting rather than concerning. She was not a person who experienced the absence of others as loss unless the absence had the specific quality that Edward's absence had, the quality of the thing that was not coming back. Dorothea's 4 days was simply 4 days, a rhythm rather than a rupture. and the rhythm of two people who lived in the same village and maintained their separate daily patterns was always going to have gaps in it. Still, she had noticed. She came on the 5th of December with a question. "The loom," she said, setting her bag on the counter and getting immediately to what she had come for, which was a quality Frances had observed in her before and which she found each time refreshing. "You weave yourself, not just selling, actually weaving." "Yes," Frances said. "Would you show me?" Then before Frances could respond, "I am not asking to learn. I am asking to watch. There is a difference." Frances looked at her, the careful look she gave to things she was evaluating. "Come Sunday afternoon," she said. 4 o'clock. Use the side door." Dorothea came on Sunday at 4 o'clock, using the side door as instructed. Frances was at the loom. She did not stop when Dorothea came in. She had learned over many years that the best way to allow someone to observe a thing was to continue doing the thing, to make the observation as natural as possible by not performing for it. Dorothea sat in the wooden chair that Frances had placed for her and watched. The loom was working a length of dark blue and grey cloth, a winter cloth, a cloth with a weight to it, and the rhythm of the weaving was its own kind of music. The regular beat of the shuttle, the press of the treadle, the movement of the beater. Frances worked in silence. The fire in the small stove gave its warmth. Outside the window, the December evening had settled into darkness. Dorothea watched for a long time without speaking. Frances wove and did not look at her, but was aware of her in the peripheral way. She was always aware of things in her immediate world, aware of the quality of her attention, which was complete and still, the same quality she had brought to the carved beam and the illegible gravestones and the ochre wool on the shelf. After perhaps half an hour, Dorothea said, very quietly, "It's the same motion over and over, but it's never the same cloth." "No," Frances said. "The thread varies, the tension varies, the light changes." She paused. "You can never step into the same loom twice." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "Heraclitus and weaving," she said. "My mother used to say it," Frances said. I'm not sure she knew she was quoting Heraclitus. A silence, warm and comfortable, in which both of them were thinking about mothers who had said things without knowing they were philosophers. Frances wove. The fire crackled. The December dark pressed against the window, and the cloth grew thread by thread in the steady accumulation of a thing being made. The Sunday weaving became a practice, though neither of them named it as such. Dorothea came the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and then it was simply something that happened on Sunday afternoons. Frances at the loom, Dorothea in the chair, the stove warming the back room, the December darkness outside the window. They talked more as the weeks progressed. Not differently. The quality of the conversation did not change, which was to say that it retained the careful, unhurried quality of their first exchanges. But more of it, the silences shorter and the subjects wider. Dorothea talked about the school, not with nostalgia, Frances noticed, but with the dry, affectionate accuracy of someone describing something they had fully inhabited and fully left. She talked about the girls, some of them, with the particular warmth of a teacher who has genuinely cared about students, without requiring them to care back. Frances talked about the weaving, not about the technical aspects, but about the quality of attention it required, which was different from the quality of attention the shop required, and both different from the quality of attention the village required on the morning walk. "There are different kinds of paying attention," she said one Sunday, not looking up from the loom. "The shop attention is wide. It takes in everything at once, the customer and the wool and the street and the bell and Ada at the back. Walking attention is moving. It follows what moves, adjusts for what's new." She pressed the beater. "Weaving attention is narrow and deep. You hold one thing and go into it completely." "Which do you prefer?" Dorothea asked. Frances considered this. "Whichever one I'm doing," she said, which was the honest answer. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I only know one kind. The wide kind. The kind that is always managing everything at once." A pause. "I am not sure I know how to do the narrow kind." "You watched the beam," Frances said. "I'm sorry. On Water Street, your first week, you stopped and looked at the carved beam for a full minute. That was the narrow kind." Dorothea was silent for a moment. That had in it something of the quality of someone being surprised by information about themselves that they had not known, and that, on reflection, they recognize as accurate. "Yes," she said, slowly. "I suppose it was." Frances walked the village every afternoon. This had been her practice for as long as she could remember. A walk that was neither exercise nor errand, but something between the two. A daily accounting of the village and its condition. A habit of attention that she performed with the same unreflective regularity that she brushed her hair or lit the evening lamp. The December village was, she had always thought, the most itself. It was at any time of year. The cold stripped the prettiness from it. The summer hanging baskets were long gone, the window boxes bare, the gardens reduced to their structures and their bare stems. And what remained was the thing itself, the timber and the plaster and the cobblestone and the lane, the architecture that had been here for 500 years and that carried in every beam and every joint and every mortared stone the accumulated presence of all the people who had lived and worked and walked in it. She was walking up Shilling Street on the 9th of December when she found Dorothea standing at the corner where Shilling Street met the lane that ran behind the Guildhall, looking at the Guildhall's back wall. The Guildhall was one of the oldest buildings in the village, built in 1529 by the Guild of Corpus Christi, a timber-framed structure of 3 stories with carved corner posts and a pargeted plaster face that was the colour of old cream in summer light and the colour of pale amber in the low December afternoon. Dorothea was looking at the wall where the timber frame was exposed at a corner, the old oak dark and enormous and slightly twisted, the mortise and tenon joints visible, the whole thing with the quality of something that had been standing in this exact position for 358 years and intended to continue. Frances stood beside her and looked at the same wall. "The oak," Dorothea said, without preamble, without turning. "It's black. The wood is black." "It goes black over time," Frances said. "The tannins in the oak oxidize. It takes centuries to get that color." "It's extraordinary," Dorothea said, "that something so old can still be—" She paused, looking for the word. "Structural, still doing its job." It's stronger than it was when it was new, Frances said. Old oak is harder than new oak. The time has compressed it. Dorothea turned and looked at her, a look that Frances had come to recognize as the look she wore when something had arrived at the right moment and in the right form. Is that true of everything? She said. I don't know, Frances said honestly. I think it might be true of some things. They stood together for a moment, looking at the 5-century-old timber. Then they walked on, side by side, in the cold December afternoon. Frances's evenings had their own shape, which she had established in the months following Edward's death, and which she maintained with the consistency of someone who has learned that structure is not the enemy of feeling, but its necessary container. Supper at 6, washing up at past, the notebook from 7:30 to 8, reading from 8 until 10, bed at 10, the fire banked for the night, the lamp extinguished, the house closed down to its own resources until morning. The reading was the part that had changed most since Edward's death. When he was alive, she had read in the sitting room while he sat in the kitchen with his newspaper. They had maintained this slightly unusual domestic arrangement for 30 years, both of them having discovered early in the marriage that separate evening rooms suited them better than the expectation of shared space, and that the occasional calling out of a sentence or a thought from one room to the other was both more natural and more genuinely communicative than the performance of togetherness that sitting in the same room sometimes required. Now, she read alone, which was different from reading while Edward was in the kitchen. The difference was small but real. The difference, again, between solitude and aloneness, between the quiet that contains a person and the quiet that does not. She had been reading, in December, a collection of Gilbert White's letters written in the 18th century about the natural world of Selborne in Hampshire, which bore, in their quality of attention and their patience with the local and the particular, a resemblance to her own notebooks that she found both humbling and companionable. White had spent his entire life in one village, as she had spent hers. He had found, in that village, more than enough. She read by the fire until 10 o'clock on the evening of the 12th of December, and then closed the book and sat for a few minutes looking at the fire, which was at its most settled hour. The coals reduced to a deep orange that gave its warmth steadily and without urgency, the sound of it almost below the threshold of hearing, a barely there crackling that was less a sound than a texture in the air. She thought about what Dorothea had asked. Is that true of everything? She thought, I was 47 when Edward was diagnosed. I was 49 when he began to be significantly unwell. I was 60 when he died. Those 13 years of managing and tending and watching and maintaining the life of the shop and the house, while the person who had been my companion in it slowly became someone who required more and more of what I could give. Those 13 years had been, she now understood, the years that had compressed her, the years that had made her harder, in the way that old oak is harder, not colder, not less feeling, more dense, more fully what she was, the unnecessary removed by the long process of being asked to give everything and discovering that the everything was available. She was not sorry for this. She was, at some level she had not previously examined, proud of it. She banked the fire, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed. On the 15th of December, Dorothea came to the shop at closing time, just before Frances was about to put up the shutters, and stood in the doorway with a look that Frances had not seen on her before, a look that was less composed than her usual expression, with the quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided, not impulsively, but deliberately, to set it down. "My husband," she said, without introduction, as though they were continuing a conversation that had been interrupted rather than beginning a new one, "chose a woman 20 years younger. He was 56. She was 36. A pause. I was not surprised. That is what disturbs me most. That I was not surprised. That some part of me had known for years, and it continued to function as though I did not know." Frances did not speak. She waited, which was her characteristic response to the beginning of a thing that was still being found. "I ran the school for 22 years, Dorothea continued. "I was very good at running it. I was not very good at—" She paused again. "At being present in my own life. Outside the school, I was good at the wide attention, managing everything at once. But at home I was—" She looked for the word with the same care she brought to choosing wool. "Absent, competent, and absent." And he filled the absence with someone else, which I understand, even if I do not entirely forgive. Frances looked at her. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." "You don't have to—" "I'm putting the kettle on for myself," Frances said, with the particular matter-of-factness that was her most effective form of kindness. "You may as well have a cup." Dorothea came in. Frances put the kettle on. They sat in the back room in the warmth of the stove and the oil lamp, and Frances made the tea, and they drank it, and Dorothea talked, and Frances listened with the full attention she brought to everything that deserved it. She talked for almost an hour. Frances said perhaps 20 sentences in that time, but each of the 20 sentences was the right one, the sentence that received what had been said without reducing it, the sentence that confirmed that it had been heard without performing confirmation. At the end of it, Dorothea was quiet for a long time, looking at the empty cup in her hands. "You are very good at this," she said at last. "I've had practice," Frances said. Christmas in Lavenham had its own quality, not the commercial Christmas of the cities, not the elaborate, anxious Christmas of households that had confused celebration with performance, but the older, quieter kind that small old English villages had maintained through habit and inclination, and the simple fact that in a place where the architecture had not changed in 500 years, the customs tended toward a similar durability. The marketplace was decorated modestly. Garlands of holly and ivy along the Guildhall's facade, a wreath on the parish notice board, candles in the windows of the houses that faced onto the square, their warm amber light visible from the far end of the marketplace as a series of small, steady beacons against the cold December dark. Frances dressed the shop window on the 22nd of December with a simplicity that was characteristic of her, a length of deep red cloth as a background, against which she arranged several skeins of wool in the colours she considered most appropriate to the season. Deep red, dark green, cream, the gold that was closest to the candlelight quality she associated with December evenings. She also placed in the centre of the arrangement a single tallow candle, unlit, which she would light on Christmas Eve and leave burning for the day. She had made Christmas this way since Edward died, simply, without elaboration, attending to it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, neither adding to it nor diminishing it. She did not find Christmas sad precisely. She found it a time when the village's accumulated character was most fully present, when the candlelight in the windows and the holly on the Guildhall and the sound of the church choir practicing in the evenings through the cold air all conspired to produce something that was not sentiment, but was the actual residue of many centuries of people in this place, marking the turning of the year with light and warmth. On the 23rd, she saw Dorothea in the marketplace, looking at the Guildhall's decorated facade with the now familiar quality of complete attention. "Will you spend Christmas here?" Frances asked, when she had come close enough. "I have nowhere else to go," Dorothea said. "My sister is in Edinburgh. My husband—" A slight pause, the pause of someone who has learned to navigate a word that has changed its meaning. "My former husband is in London. My school colleagues are dispersed." She looked at the holly on the Guildhall. "Here seems perfectly appropriate." "Come on Christmas Day," Frances said. 2 o'clock, Water Street. Dorothea looked at her. "I don't want to impose." "You won't," Frances said. "I'm asking." Christmas Day was cold and still and clear, with a specific quality of English Christmas mornings that is unlike any other morning of the year. A stillness that is not ordinary stillness, but the stillness of the world, having paused briefly in its ordinary business. A quiet that contains within it the accumulated quiet of many other Christmases in many other years. A quality that Frances had always found less religious than temporal. The sense of civilization taking a breath. She walked the village at 7 in the morning, before the day had properly begun. The streets were empty. Her boots on the cobblestones were the only sound. The frost was hard, the coldest morning of the winter so far, and every surface was white and precise and crystalline in the pre-dawn grey. She walked up Church Street, around the church, through the churchyard. She stopped at Edward's grave, a brief, habitual stop, the kind that required no particular emotion but marked simply that she remembered, and then walked on, through the gate, along the lane beside the priory, back through the marketplace. The village in this silence, and this cold, and this particular grey-white light of a frosted Christmas morning was, she thought, as beautiful as it ever was. Not dramatically beautiful, not the beauty of spectacle or of the unusual, but the beauty of something that has been exactly what it is for a very long time, and has, through the long practice of being itself, arrived at a form of completeness. She was back at the cottage at 8:30. She made tea. She sat by the kitchen window and looked at the frost on the garden wall and drank the tea slowly, in the way she drank it on mornings when she had no particular reason to hurry, and thought about the day. At 2 o'clock there would be a knock at the side door, and she found, considering this, something she had not expected to find. She was looking forward to it. Not in the anxious or anticipatory way. Not looking forward to it because the time before it was unpleasant, which was not the case, but looking forward to it in the way that you look forward to a thing that will be good in its own right, whose goodness you can trust even in advance of its occurrence. She had not felt this about Christmas for some years. She wrote in her notebook, Christmas morning, hard frost, the village very still and very itself. I think this year I am not only receiving the season, but meeting it. There is a difference. Dorothea arrived at 2 o'clock precisely. Frances had expected nothing less, carrying a bottle of good Madeira wine and a small, paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to contain, when opened, a wooden bobbin she had found in the antique dealers on the marketplace, carved with the same foliage pattern as the 16th century beam on Water Street. "I thought," she said, handing it over, "it might be useful, or at least suitable." Frances held the bobbin and looked at it, the carving, the worn smooth wood of its barrel, the history in the weight and the texture of it. "It's beautiful," she said, which was true, and returned it to Dorothea for a moment so that she could take her coat, and then accepted it back and set it on the shelf above the loom where she kept the things that were not strictly functional but were too right for this space to put anywhere else. The sitting room was prepared in the way Frances prepared things, without elaboration, with full attention to the essentials. A good fire, 2 chairs arranged to face both the fire and each other, a small table between them set with the good china that she used rarely, and that therefore retained the quality of specialness. The Madeira open on the mantelpiece. They ate at 4, a simple meal, carefully chosen and carefully made, in the way that Frances did everything: roasted chicken, root vegetables, bread she had baked that morning, still warm enough to be what bread should be, a pudding she had made on the Sunday before Advent in the old way, as her mother had taught her. They talked through the meal and through the long evening that followed it, by the fire with the Madeira, and then the tea that came after. They talked about things that had not been talked about before, not because the subjects had been avoided, but because they had not yet been reached, the conversation having had, from the beginning, its own unhurried pace, arriving at things in the order that they were ready to be arrived at. Dorothea talked about her parents. Frances talked about Edward, really talked, not the careful managed talking of the first months, but the fuller, more honest talking of someone who has had enough time and enough silence to find the accurate words. At 10 o'clock, Dorothea put on her coat. At the door, she turned. "Thank you," she said, and there was in the 2 words a weight that they do not ordinarily carry, the weight of a person who has had, for the first time in a long time, a day that was genuinely and completely good. "Come again on Sunday," Frances said. Dorothea nodded. She went out into the cold Christmas night. Frances closed the door and stood in the hall for a moment, in the warmth of the house and the silence of the closed door, and felt that the day had been, in the fullest and most honest sense of the word, sufficient. In the days between Christmas and the New Year, Lavenham settled into the particular quiet of that interval, the quiet of a place that has completed one thing and has not yet begun another, a pause in the year's rhythm that Frances had always found among the most restful passages of time. She kept the shop closed between Christmas and the 2nd of January, as she did every year. She spent the days walking and reading and weaving, the 3 activities that constituted her most essential self, the 3 things she would have done if there had been no shop, no village, no other people requiring anything of her. She also wrote. The notebook that she had begun in October was nearly full. and she found, opening it on the 27th of December and reading back through the entries, that the year that the notebook contained was a different year from the years that the preceding notebooks contained. The difference was not in what she had observed. The quality of her observation had not changed, she thought, or had changed only in the way that things improve through long practice. The difference was in what she had been observing. The notebooks from the years of Edward's illness were full of the village and the shop and the seasons, but the people in them were few and peripheral, moved through the entries as background figures. This notebook had people in it. Dorothea was in it. The quality of her attention, the dark wool she had chosen, the hands around the teacup, the things she had said, and the way she had said them. Frances sat with this observation for some time, looking at the fire. She thought, I did not know I had been lonely. This was not quite accurate. She had known in the way that you know things you are not yet ready to examine. But she had not known it clearly enough to name it, or hadn't named it to herself as something else. Self-sufficiency, or preference for solitude, or the particular satisfaction of a life arranged around one's own rhythms. She wrote, I think loneliness is not what I thought it was. I thought it was the state of being without company. I think now that it is the state of being without a witness, without someone who, by their presence and their attention, confirms that what you see is worth seeing and what you feel is real. Edward was that for 38 years, and then he was not, and the absence of that, the witnessing, is what I have been carrying these 11 months, without knowing what to call it. She closed the notebook. She looked at the fire. She thought about Dorothea Marsh, who was 58 years old and had come to Lavenham with a photograph and a great many books and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 22 years being fully present for others and not at all present for oneself. She thought, we are, perhaps, useful to each other. Then she thought, that is too small a word. Useful. Try again. She did not find the right word that evening, but she found the shape of it, which was sufficient for a start. On the 30th of December, Dorothea came to the house, not the shop, which was still closed, but the house, using the side door as she had learned to do, and found Frances in the kitchen making bread. She sat at the kitchen table and watched Frances make bread in the same way she had watched Frances weave, with the full attention, the absence of performance, the quality of a person genuinely interested in what another person's hands are doing and why. You do everything the same way, Dorothea said, after a time. The same way I do everything else, Frances said, without looking up from the dough. Or the same way as last time. The same way as everything else, Dorothea said. The weaving, the bread, the shop, the same quality of being in it, fully in it. Frances was quiet for a moment, feeling the dough under her hands, the way it had changed in the last minutes from resistance to something more cooperative, the gluten developing, the texture shifting. I learned from my mother, she said. She used to say, whatever your hands are doing, let them do it completely. Don't make the bread while you're thinking about the weaving. Make the bread. That sounds simple. It is simple. The difficulty is in not doing the other thing, not thinking about the weaving, keeping the attention where the hands are. Dorothea was quiet. Frances turned the dough and shaped it with the practiced, unhurried motion of someone who has made this same shape many hundreds of times and finds each time that the shape is slightly different and that this difference is one of the small pleasures of the act. I think, Dorothea said slowly, that I have spent most of my adult life thinking about the weaving while making the bread. Frances looked at her over the risen dough across the kitchen table. Yes, she said, I think you probably have. A silence, warm and without discomfort. But you are making the bread now, Frances said. Look at you. Dorothea looked down at her hands, which were resting flat on the kitchen table, perfectly still. She looked at them for a moment with the careful, slightly surprised expression of someone noticing something about themselves that they had not noticed before. Yes, she said, I suppose I am. New Year's Eve in Lavenham was a quiet affair. The village did not make a great ceremony of it. There were no public gatherings, no organized celebrations, only the private markings of private households, and at midnight the church bell, which rang in the new year with the same measured patience it applied to every hour of every day, as though the year itself was simply one more thing to be counted and received. Frances sat by her fire until midnight. She had done this every New Year's Eve for as many years as she could remember, sat with the fire and the silence and whatever she was reading, and waited for the bell and received the new year as it arrived. This year, she was not alone. Dorothea had come at 9 o'clock by invitation, and they had eaten supper and talked, and now sat in the comfortable silence of people who had established enough between them that silence required no filling. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 5 minutes to midnight. What are you thinking? Dorothea asked. The first words either of them had spoken in 20 minutes. About years, Frances said, about what it means for a year to end. I used to think it meant something, a real division, a real beginning. Now I think it is more like the marks on a ruler, not divisions in the thing itself, but ways of measuring the thing. The thing being what? Time, Frances said, or life. They are not quite the same, but they are related. Dorothea considered this. I think I came here because I wanted to start over, she said. New year in a new place, a clean beginning. A pause. But I think now that clean beginnings are not quite available to us. We bring ourselves. The beginning cannot be clean because we are in it, and we are not new. No, Frances said, but we can be new in our attention. She looked at the fire. That, I think, is the one thing that can always begin again. Not the life, not the year, not the circumstances, but the attention we bring to them. The clock began to strike. Frances counted 1, 2, 3, as she always counted, the counting itself, a form of attention, a small, deliberate act of being present in the beginning of a thing. When the 12th stroke died away, they sat for a moment in the silence that followed it. Happy New Year, Dorothea said. Happy New Year, Frances replied. The fire settled. The village outside was silent and cold and entirely itself. The new year had arrived in the same way that all important things arrive, quietly, without announcement, already fully present before it was named. January in Lavenham was the month that asked the most of you and offered the least in return. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about Lavenham in January, nothing cruel or extreme, but simply and consistently, in the way that plain grey cold and flat grey light and short grey days accumulate into a kind of unadorned challenge to the person who must meet them every morning. Frances met January every morning. She had done so for 61 years, and she had arrived over the course of those years at a relationship with January that was not warm precisely, but was honest. The relationship of someone who has stopped expecting a month to be what it is not, and has learned instead to find what it genuinely offers, which is less spectacular but more reliable than what the other months provide. What January offered, primarily, was clarity, the clarity of a world stripped of colour and ornament, the bare trees and the grey fields and the pale cold light and the cobblestones white with frost or dark with damp, all of it showing itself without embellishment, without the softening influence of foliage or warmth or the long, clear light of summer. January was the month in which the village showed its bones, and Frances had always found bones, properly understood, more interesting than the surfaces that covered them. She walked every afternoon, as she walked every afternoon. The walks in January had their own character, shorter in the light available, necessarily, the darkness coming by 4 o'clock, but she walked them with the same quality of attention she brought to the other months, noting what January had that October and November and December did not, the quality of the January frost, which was different from the December frost, more patient, more settled, as though it had stopped being a visitor and had decided to stay. The quality of the January sky, which on clear days had a blue to it that was completely different from the blue of any other season, a cold, precise blue, the colour of something that has been refined to its essential component. On the 5th of January, she walked up Church Street and found Dorothea walking down it. They had not arranged this encounter. They met, as they often met now, simply because they were two people who walked the same streets at the same hours and whose paths had developed the habit of crossing. "Good afternoon," Frances said. "Good afternoon," Dorothea said. They fell into step together, turning at the bottom of Church Street and walking along the lane that ran past the Priory toward the marketplace, as they had done several times now, the walk having established itself as the natural route for the two of them together, the way routes establish themselves between people who walk the same territory regularly, not by decision, but by the accumulated preference of repeated choice. "How are the rooms?" Frances asked. It was a question she asked occasionally, as a way of asking something larger without requiring a large answer. "Warm now," Dorothea said. "I have learned the stove." A pause. "And good. The rooms are good. I have been reading, walking, thinking." She paused again, in the way she paused when she was choosing her words carefully, getting slower. "Is that welcome?" Frances asked. "More than I expected," Dorothea said. Frances's mornings in January followed the same pattern they followed in every other month, modified by January's particular light and cold. The ritual of the stove and the kettle and the kitchen window and the tea in the Windsor chair remained unchanged, because the ritual was not a response to the season, but a response to the morning itself, to the simple fact of another day beginning, which required the same quality of attention in January as it required in October. From the kitchen window, looking east into the dark garden, she watched January do what January did, the frost deepening on the garden wall in the coldest weeks, the bare apple tree's branches more precisely outlined each morning against the pale sky, the light increasing by its almost imperceptible daily increment, too small to be perceived on any single day, but measurable over the weeks. The mornings at 7 o'clock becoming fractionally less dark as the month progressed. She noted these increments in the notebook with the care of a scientist recording observations. January 8th. Light at 7 a.m. marginally increased from the first, the apple tree's eastern branches catching the grey light differently. The sun's angle changed. Not spring, not close to spring, but the movement exists. She noted also, without making any particular analysis of the noting, that she had begun to look up the street when she opened the shutters in the morning, knowing that Dorothea's morning walk to the baker's took her past the shop at 7:15, and finding in the brief glimpse of the grey coat and the measured stride a small but genuine warmth. This was new. Not the observation, she observed everything, but the warmth in the observation. The sense that the village's daily life contained now something that was specifically for her. A face she was glad to see, a presence whose existence in the same small street as her own gave the morning an additional quality of companionship that she had not known she was missing until it was there. She was careful not to make too much of this. She was a person who had learned through long experience the difference between what was genuinely present and what was wished into presence by the force of wanting, and she had no desire to misread what was between herself and Dorothea, whose situation was still recent, and whose stillness was still provisional, and who was still, in some fundamental sense, finding out what she was when she was not a headmistress in an Islington school. But she allowed herself the warmth. It was real, and she was, at 61, done with the habit of diminishing things that were real. Dorothea had begun to write. Frances discovered this on a Sunday in the second week of January. Discovered it in the way she discovered most things, through observation rather than disclosure. Dorothea arrived for the Sunday afternoon weaving session with an ink stain on the side of her right hand's middle finger. The specific stain that comes not from occasional writing, but from sustained writing. The stain of someone who has been writing for some hours that day. Frances noted it without comment, but the observation filed itself alongside the others. The steadiness of the hands, the careful choosing, the quality of attention she brought to things, and added to the accumulating picture. She mentioned it, eventually, in the way she eventually mentioned things that she had been observing for some time, when the moment arrived that made the mention natural rather than intrusive. "You've been writing," she said. They were in the back room, Frances at the loom, Dorothea in the chair, the stove warm, the January dark pressing against the window. Dorothea looked at her hand. "Yes," she said. "What?" A pause, the deliberate pause of choosing the accurate word. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "It began as a letter to a former student, a girl who is now 40, I suppose. A woman I think about, who was difficult when she was 14 and became, I think, interesting as a result of that difficulty." She looked at the ink stain. "But it became something else, something longer, a kind of," she paused again, "record of where I am, what I'm seeing, the way the Guildhall looks in the afternoon, the sound of the church bell, the way Mrs. Holt—" She stopped and looked up with the slightly self-conscious expression of someone who has inadvertently spoken a name. "The way Mrs. Holt what?" Frances said, without embarrassment. "The way Mrs. Holt weaves," Dorothea said, meeting the directness with her own, "and the way she listens, and the way the shop smells in January, and the way the village looks when it has decided to be entirely what it is." Frances looked at the cloth forming on the loom. "That sounds like a good thing to write," she said. "It feels—" Dorothea looked for the word. "It feels like the narrow attention, the deep kind, the kind you described." "Yes," Frances said, "that's what it is." The notebook that Frances kept was joined, in January, by the awareness that someone else was keeping one, or something equivalent, something that served the function of a record, the function of preserving what would otherwise be lost. She found this companionable in a way she had not anticipated, the knowledge that Dorothea's writing existed somewhere in the rooms on Church Street, noting the village and its qualities, a parallel record running alongside her own. She thought about the wool merchants who had built the church, how they had understood that the building would remain as evidence of something they had felt. She thought about Gilbert White and his letters from Selborne, preserving the particular way the swallows arrived in a specific Hampshire village in a specific decade of the 18th century. She thought about her own 17 notebooks and their record of 61 Lavenham years. She thought, the impulse to record is the impulse to say this was here, this was real, this mattered. It is a form of resistance to the idea that things pass without consequence. A small insistence on permanence in the face of impermanence. She wrote this in the notebook on the 14th of January, and then added, in the more compressed hand she used when she was thinking faster than usual, "DM is writing. This pleases me more than I had expected it to. The village now has 2 records running concurrently. This seems right. The village has been recorded before. It appears in documents from the 13th century, in the wool merchants' accounts, in the parish registers, in the histories that sit on the shelf in the reading room of the library, on the marketplace. But these were official records, records of transactions and events. What Dee and I are writing is something else, the record of attention itself, of what it is like to be in this place, paying attention in this specific season of this specific year. I do not know that anyone will ever read either of these notebooks. I find that this does not trouble me. The writing is not for readers, it is for the writing." She read this back and decided it was true, and closed the notebook and went to make supper. On the 20th of January, there was a fog. Suffolk fogs were different from the fogs of higher or more dramatic landscapes. They were not the theatrical fogs of coastal headlands or of mountain valleys, arriving with a quality of event. They were quiet, patient fogs that came in from the flat fields to the east and settled into the village with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this for a very long time and knows exactly how to proceed. The village in the fog was entirely different from the village in any other weather. The timber frames and the plaster walls, which in clear weather presented themselves with the full detail of their age and their beauty, became in the fog suggestions of themselves. The ochre and cream and pink of the plaster was muted to a uniform pale grey. The carved beams were visible only in outline. The church tower, which in clear weather dominated the village's skyline, with the massive authority of something built to be seen from 10 miles in every direction, was entirely gone, not invisible so much as absent, a vacancy in the grey where it had been. Frances walked in the fog at her usual afternoon hour and found it, as she found all of Suffolk's particular weather, entirely suited to the place. The fog slowed everything and softened everything, and required you to attend more closely to what was immediately around you, the 3 or 4 feet of visible ground, the surfaces that emerged from the grey as you approached them, and retreated back into it as you passed. She found Dorothea at the foot of the church tower, which was visible only as a dark shape in the grey until you were almost upon it. Looking up at the tower's base, where the carved stonework of the lower courses was more fully visible in the flat fog light than it ever was in direct light or shadow. "I've been lost for 20 minutes, Dorothea said. "I know perfectly well that the marketplace is north, but the fog has taken away every reference point, and my sense of direction is apparently more dependent on sight than I had believed." "Follow the wall," Frances said. "Put your right hand on the churchyard wall and walk north. The wall ends at the gate, and the gate opens onto Church Street. That's simple." "Most things are," Frances said, "when you know the particular wall." They walked together, Frances slightly ahead, Dorothea's hand on the wall, the fog closing around them. The village sounds in the fog were different, softer, more directionless, arriving from unexpected angles, the usual landmarks of sound disoriented. But Frances moved through it without uncertainty, her long knowledge of the streets and their particular distances and angles serving her where sight could not, the knowledge in her feet and her body as much as in her mind. "You could walk this blindfolded," Dorothea said. "Probably," Frances said, "though I've never tried." The fog persisted for 3 days, lifting on the 23rd to reveal the village with the particular clarity that always followed fog, as though the grey had cleaned the air, and what remained was a precision of light and surface that the preceding weeks had not contained. Frances stood in the shop doorway on the morning of the 23rd and looked at Water Street in the post-fog clarity, and found it, as she found the village in all its manifestations, exactly and entirely itself. The carved beam on the house opposite, the cobblestones, the plane tree's bare branches against the now clear January sky, all of it more vivid than before, the surfaces more defined, the colours richer. Even the January colours, which were the most restrained of any month, had something in them this morning that was not usually there, a quality of presence, of emphasis. She had been thinking about Dorothea's question from the Guildhall. Is that true of everything? Does time make things stronger? And she had arrived, over the weeks since she had first been asked it, at something that was closer to an answer than what she had said at the time. She thought, time makes things clearer, not necessarily stronger, not necessarily better, but more definitively what they are. The process that turns new oak black does not only harden the wood, it reveals the grain. It makes visible the structure that was always there, but was hidden under the freshness of the new. This was true of buildings. It might be true of people. She thought about Dorothea's increasing ease in the village, the way she walked now, which was slower and more attentive than the pace she had arrived with. the pace of someone who has begun to inhabit a place rather than passing through it. She thought about the ink stain, the bread she had watched being made, the things she had said about clean beginnings. She thought, the process is underway in her. The grain is becoming visible. It takes time, and it takes the right conditions, cold and stillness, and the patient company of old things. But it is happening. She was glad to be part of the conditions. Dorothea came on the last Sunday of January and sat in the back room while Frances wove and brought this time her own cup. A plain white cup from the rooms on Church Street that she had apparently decided to keep at the shop, setting it on the shelf above the stove, beside the carved bobbin she had given at Christmas, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has decided that a space belongs to them in some partial but genuine sense. Frances noted the cup on the shelf and said nothing, but she noted it. They were talking about January, about the specific quality of the month, in the way they had come to talk about the seasons, not abstractly but with the particularity of two people who had been present in the same place through the same season and had therefore something specific and shared to discuss. I used to dread January, Dorothea said. The school in January was the hardest part of the year. The girls were tired from Christmas. The heating was unreliable. The light was bad. Half the staff were unwell. January felt like an assault. And here, Frances asked, her hands continuing their rhythm. Here it feels. Dorothea paused, looking for the word with the same care she always brought to words. Restful, not easy. I understand now that what you mean by the lane being simple is not the same as easy. It requires something. It requires you to meet it rather than waiting for it to entertain you. She held her cup. But when you meet it, it gives something back. Something that the other months can't give, because the other months have more colour, more warmth, more variety. January has nothing to spare. What it gives is what it has, and what it has is enough. Frances listened to this and found it accurate, more than accurate. She found it the most precise description of January she had heard from someone who had not been in Lavenham long enough to take it for granted. How long have you been here? She said. In total, 11 weeks, Dorothea said, with the tone of someone who has done the arithmetic recently and found the result surprising. It feels longer, in the good sense. The village does that, Frances said. It takes you in at its own pace. Once it has taken you in, time runs differently. Dorothea looked at the loom, at the growing cloth. Like the weaving, she said. Yes, Frances said. Exactly like the weaving. On the last day of January, Frances took out the 17th notebook and began the 18th. The first entry read, February begins tomorrow. I have been in the same village for 61 years and the same house for all but the 3 I spent in my grandmother's house when I was very small. And I have watched the seasons turn so many times that you would think the transitions would have become unremarkable, would have lost the quality of event. They have not. Each November surprises me with its honesty, each December with its cold, each February with the first intimation, always earlier than you expect, always more tentative than it will eventually become, of the light's return. This January has been different from previous Januaries in one respect. It has been shared, not in any formal sense. Dee has her own life and her own rooms, and her own mornings and evenings, and I have mine, and neither of us has made any arrangement that would compromise this independence, which we both, I think, value in ourselves and recognize in each other. But the sharing exists nonetheless. It exists in the Sunday afternoons and the afternoon walks and the chance encounters on Church Street, and it exists in the knowledge that someone else is walking these streets and looking at these buildings and writing down what they see. The village has 2 witnesses now. It has had one for 11 years. The addition of the second has not halved what the first provides. It has, in some way, I cannot yet fully articulate, doubled it. A lane witnessed by 2 people is different from a lane witnessed by one, even when neither of the 2 is present. She stopped writing and looked at this and thought, yes, that is it. That is the thing I have been trying to name since September. She wrote one more line. We are useful to each other. Then she paused and added, no, we are necessary to each other. There is a difference. February arrived as it always arrived in Suffolk, provisionally, making no firm commitments, offering on some days the clear cold of a winter that had no intention of ending, and on other days something that was not warmth, but was the memory of warmth, a quality of the light that was slightly different from January's light, arriving at a fractionally different angle, catching surfaces that January's light had left in shadow, and producing in those surfaces a warmth that was less a temperature than a colour. Frances noticed the change in the light on the 3rd of February, standing at the kitchen window with her morning tea. It was not dramatic. It was never dramatic in this part of England, where the seasons conducted themselves with the same restrained efficiency as the people. But it was real, and it was perceptible to someone who had been attending carefully to the light through a Suffolk winter for 61 years. She stood at the window for a longer time than usual, confirming what she was seeing, feeling the quality of it with the same attention she had given to the October gap light in the canopy and the December frost's blue luminosity. This was different from both. This was the February light, the light of the year's first returning warmth, barely there, not enough to change the temperature by so much as a degree, but present as a quality, as an undertone in the morning grey. She wrote in the notebook, February 3rd. It is beginning. The angle of the light has changed. Not warm yet, but no longer the same cold. The plane tree's branches catching it differently this morning. The south-facing surfaces of the bark taking on a slight warmth that the north-facing surfaces do not have. This is how it always starts. Not the warmth, but the precondition of warmth. The world preparing. She went to open the shop with a feeling, familiar from previous Februaries, but no less welcome for the familiarity of something having shifted, not arrived, not yet, but shifted. The direction changed. On the 6th of February, Frances found the first thing. She was walking her usual afternoon route, Water Street, up Church Street, around the Priory, back through the marketplace, when she saw, at the base of the old stone wall beside the Priory, a small cluster of snowdrops, 3 of them, growing in the thin strip of soil between the flint wall and the cobblestones, very small and very white, their heads not yet fully open, but committed to the act of being there. She stopped. She crouched. In the way she crouched to look at small things, the unhurried crouch of someone for whom the act of looking closely was both natural and important, and looked at the snowdrops for a long time. They were, she thought, among the most specifically beautiful things she'd seen in months. Not beautiful in a general way, not beautiful in the way that the October evening light on the timber frames was beautiful, or the Christmas frost on the cobblestones. Beautiful in the particular, precise, individual way of 3 specific snowdrops in the specific thin soil of a specific February afternoon in a specific year of a specific life. Their white, the most vivid white, in a world that had been, for months, entirely in the grey and brown and pale cold range. She took out the small notebook from her coat pocket, the field notebook, the one she carried for immediate observations, and wrote, February 6th, snowdrops. 3. South-facing base of the Priory wall. The year has turned. Not arrived, turned. The direction is established. She straightened. She adjusted her coat. She walked onto the marketplace. She found Dorothea there, looking at the Guildhall. Snowdrops, Frances said, without preamble. Dorothea turned. Something crossed her face, a quick, open expression, unguarded, the expression of someone receiving good news they'd been waiting for without quite knowing they were waiting. Show me, she said. They walked back to the Priory wall together. They stood together at the Priory wall and looked at the 3 snowdrops. Dorothea was quiet for some time. Frances stood beside her and allowed the silence, which was the right response. I planted snowdrops in a garden in Islington, Dorothea said at last. 20 years ago. The garden of the school. I planted them against the south-facing wall in October, and they came up in February, and I remember this clearly, that they were beautiful, and then immediately thinking that I hadn't time for them and moving on. She looked at the 3 small white heads. I didn't stand and look, not the way you looked just now. You're looking now, Frances said. I am, Dorothea said. A pause. It's different, looking without the next thing already demanding you. Yes, Frances said. That's what the lane does, or the village. It removes the next thing, not permanently. The next thing is always there. But for the time of the looking, it can wait. Dorothea was quiet for another long moment. I think, she said slowly, that I have been living as though everything were urgent, as though every moment were a transition to the next moment, rather than a thing in itself. And now, she looked at the snowdrops. Now I am looking at snowdrops, and the snowdrops are enough. The snowdrops are precisely and entirely enough. Frances felt something that she would later write about in the notebook, a warmth that was not simply the warmth of the February light, though it was related to it, the warmth of witnessing something that had needed to happen happening, of being present when a thing arrived at its completion. She had been present, she thought, for the whole arc of it. The fog-grey, exhausted woman walking up Water Street in November, the careful choosing of dark blue wool, the hands around the cup, the Sunday afternoons, the bread and the loom, the church bell and the carved beam and the black oak timber and the fog. And now, in February, the snowdrops. The year, she said, keeps its promises. The Sundays in February were different from the Sundays of January and December. It was a difference of quality rather than of activity. They did the same things they had been doing. The back room, the loom, the stove, the tea, the conversation that moved where it moved without rushing. but the quality had shifted. The way the quality of light had shifted, something had loosened, something that had been careful and provisional. The caution of two people feeling their way toward each other, neither wishing to presume, had given way to a more settled ease, the ease of people who have established enough between them to know what they have. Dorothea talked more freely in February than she had in November or December. Not more volubly, she was never voluminous, but more openly, the words less chosen and more arrived at, less the result of deliberate selection, and more the result of thoughts, thinking themselves aloud in the presence of someone they trusted. She talked about the school in ways she had not talked about it before. Not the institution, but the particular girls, the ones she still thought about, the ones she had failed, and the ones she had helped, and the handful she had watched become something larger than the school could contain. She talked about her sister in Edinburgh with the warmth of genuine love and the slight, affectionate exasperation of someone who has been loved back imperfectly but faithfully. She talked about what she was writing, not its content, which she kept private, but its quality, the way it had changed since she began, become less a record and more a discovery. Frances listened. She asked the question that was needed when it was needed. She wove. The February afternoons were longer now. The light at 4 o'clock had something in it that the January 4 o'clock had not. A residual warmth from the changed angle of the sun. A warmth that came through the back room's small window and fell across the loom and across Dorothea's hands and across the teacups on the small table. On the last Sunday of February, Dorothea brought, without comment, a second cup from Church Street and placed it on the shelf beside her first one. Frances looked at the two cups on the shelf. She looked at Dorothea. "One for the morning," Dorothea said, matter-of-factly. "One for the afternoon." Frances almost laughed. She did not. But she felt, in the place where laughter comes from, something warm and complete. The notebook entry for the last day of February read, "We are at the turn of the season. Not there yet, not close to there, but past the midpoint of winter, the long slope towards spring begun. The snowdrops at the priory wall are fully open now, joined by a dozen more, and this morning I saw, at the foot of the churchyard south wall, the first crocuses, purple and cream, very small, very early, committed entirely to the act of being here. D is well, not recovered. I do not think the word recovered applies to what has happened to her, which is not an illness from which one recovers, but a life that has reached a crisis from which one must, if one is fortunate and sufficiently honest with oneself, grow. She is growing. The pace she walks with now is the pace of someone who has learned that the street requires attention. She looks at things. She writes things down. She came on Thursday afternoon unannounced and sat in the back room for 2 hours reading while I wove, and neither of us spoke for the first hour, and this was not awkward. This is a significant thing. The comfortable silence between two people who have not known each other long is perhaps the most reliable indicator I know of the quality of what is between them. I think about Edward, not with sadness, particularly, with the honest, clear feeling that comes when you think about something that was very good and is over. He was my long companion, my witness of 38 years. His silence was a gift, as the stone says. What I have with Dee is not what I had with Edward. She is not my companion in the same way, has not been, cannot be in the same way, but it is its own thing, with its own quality, and I have lived long enough to know that things that are their own thing, and not the imitation of other things worth having. She closed the notebook. She sat for a long time looking at the fire. She thought, it is enough. February has been enough. The whole winter has been enough. Then she thought, and March is coming. March came in with a confidence that February had not possessed. It was not warm. It would not be warm, genuinely warm, for weeks yet. But it had the quality of a month that has decided to be what it is. The light was the most immediately noticeable change. The morning light at 7 o'clock was now a real light, a light with direction to it, coming from the east at an angle that was definitively different from the shallow winter angles. And in it, the village looked different again from the village of the preceding months. The colours of the plaster, the ochre and the cream and the pink, were more saturated than they had been in December and January, receiving this slightly warmer light and returning it with a particular warmth that only plaster can produce. Frances opened the shop on the 1st of March and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at Water Street in the first March morning. The cobblestones were damp. It had rained in the night, and they reflected the morning sky in a blue-grey that was, this morning, tinged with something warmer than grey. The plane tree at the corner had buds. She had been watching for them through February, noting their progress from the tiny dormant swellings of January to the barely perceptible thickening of late February to this. Actual buds, small and tight and green, unmistakably green, the first green on the bare branches since October. She looked at the buds for some time. Then she went inside and wrote in the notebook. March 1st. The buds, green. The plane tree at the corner of Water Street, showing the first green of the year. This is the kind of moment that does not require analysis. It requires only that you stop and receive it. I stopped. I received it. The world intends to continue in the way it always has. And this is one of the finest things I know. She put the notebook away. Ada arrived and lit the lamp. The first customer of the morning came in, Mrs. Alderton's sister, wanting cream wool for the summer tablecloths she had apparently been planning since Christmas. And the shop opened itself to the March morning, and Frances moved through the day with the particular ease that came from having been in the right place, paying the right kind of attention, for long enough that the ease was not something she achieved, but something she inhabited. Dorothea had been writing for 10 weeks by the 1st of March, and the thing she was writing had grown, she told Frances, from a letter to something else. She still did not have a name for it, which she said with the slight frustration of a person accustomed to precision who has encountered something that resists it. It is not a diary, she said. It is too much about the outside, the village, the buildings, the light, to be a diary. Mine is not a diary either, Frances said. I call it a record of observations. That is closer, Dorothea said. But mine has more argument in it, more reasoning. I'm not only observing, I'm trying to work something out. What I am made of, Dorothea said, with the directness that had become more natural in her over the winter. What is left when the job goes and the marriage goes and the London life goes? Or the actual Frances Holt? She stopped. The actual Dorothea Marsh, she corrected with a slightly wry expression, is made of underneath the things she has been for 22 years. And what are you finding? Frances asked. A pause. A long one, the kind that meant real thinking rather than reticence. That I am more myself than I thought, Dorothea said at last. The years at the school did not subtract from me, as I had feared. They compress me, as you said about the oak. What is left is denser than what went in, more certain. She looked at her hands, and that I am capable of the narrow attention after all. It just needed the right conditions. Suffolk in winter, Frances said. Suffolk in winter, Dorothea agreed. And a wool shop, and a woman who knows when to make tea and when not to speak, and when to say the exact right thing at the exact right moment. Frances looked at her. I only said what was there to be said. Yes, Dorothea said. That is what I mean. The loom cloth was finished on the second Sunday of March. Frances cut it from the loom with the care and the slight ceremony she always brought to the completion of a piece of work. Not a dramatic ceremony, nothing announced or performed, but the quality of attention that marks a conclusion. The cloth came free of the loom with a sound that was barely there, the soft release of tension, the weight of the completed thing resting in her hands. She held it for a moment. It was a good cloth. She knew it was good in the way she knew things about the quality of what she made through the accumulated judgment of long practice. The dark blue and the grey were well balanced, the tension even across the full length, the colour deep and consistent. It would make a coat, she thought, or curtains for a cold-facing room, something that needed weight and warmth. Dorothea was watching from the chair. It's beautiful, she said. It's good, Frances said, which was what she said about things she was satisfied with. Not beautiful. Why not beautiful? Beautiful is for things that are more than what they need to be, Frances said. This is exactly what it needs to be. That's a different thing. Dorothea was quiet for a moment, looking at the cloth in Frances's hands. I think, she said, that might be the highest compliment. Frances folded the cloth carefully, the folds even and deliberate. She set it on the shelf. What do you do now? Dorothea asked. Now that the cloth is finished? I begin the next one, Frances said. I have been planning the next one since January. She looked at the empty loom. Spring colours, I think. Greens and creams. Something lighter. Something lighter, Dorothea said, and there was in her voice a warmth that was not only about the cloth. Something lighter, Frances agreed. The village in the third week of March was doing what the village did in the third week of March, which was to say that it was cautiously, incrementally, with a characteristic Suffolk restraint in all matters, beginning to be spring. The plane tree's buds had opened, not leaves, not yet, but the swollen, slightly sticky stage that precedes leaves, the stage at which the buds are preparing themselves for the transition from what they have been all winter to what they will be for the next 7 months. The priory wall snowdrops had been joined by crocuses in purple and yellow, and the churchyard's south-facing border had a line of early daffodil leaves, not flowering yet but present, reaching, available. Frances walked her afternoon route on the 20th of March and found, at each of the places she passed every day, the evidence of the same process in its various stages. The lime tree on Church Street still bare. It was always the last to come into leaf. She had noted this over many years, but the elder in the lane beside the priory already greening, its small buds breaking into the first miniature leaves of the season. She walked and noted and felt, as she felt every March, the particular quality of the season's turning, not the dramatic pleasure of full spring, which would come in April and May, and which was, she sometimes thought, almost too much, too rich, too given all at once. But this earlier, more tentative quality, the quality of things that are in the process of becoming and have not yet become, the quality of potential fully realized but not yet fully expressed. She thought about Dorothea. She thought about the word she had been searching for since January, the word that was larger than useful and more precise than necessary. She thought companion, not in the sense of someone who accompanies, though that was there, not in the diminished modern sense of the word, in the older sense, from the Latin, com and panis, with bread, the person you break bread with, the person who shares the table, the person in whose presence the simple act of eating becomes something that it is not when you eat alone. She had had that for 38 years. She had it again. She walked home through the March afternoon with the particular quality of contentment that comes not from the presence of something desired, but from the recognition that something desired is already present, the contentment of arrival rather than approach. On the 22nd of March, Dorothea came to the shop with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of the dark blue wool from her first purchase. She set it on the counter. "Open it," she said, with the quelqu'un matter-of-fact directness that was, Frances had come to understand, her way of disguising the things she cared most about. Frances opened it. Inside was a small book, cloth-bound, hand-stitched, the kind of book that is not purchased but made. The pages were handwritten, in Dorothea's precise, considered hand. On the first page, in larger letters, Lavenham, November 1887 to March 1888. "It is a fair copy," Dorothea said, "of what I wrote this winter, the things I saw, the things I understood, the things—" She paused. "The things about this village and about the woman in the wool shop." Frances did not speak for a moment. She looked at the book in her hands. The weight of it, the texture of the cloth cover, the quality of the hand-stitching. She opened it to the middle and read a single sentence. "Mrs. Holt has the quality of the old oak beams. She has been in this place so long and has been so thoroughly herself within it that she is no longer entirely separable from it, as the beams are no longer separable from the houses they have become." She closed the book. "I will read it tonight," she said, "by the fire, as it deserves to be read." Dorothea nodded. She picked up her bag. At the door she turned. "Thank you," she said, "for the winter." "The winter was itself," Frances said. "I was only in it." "You were more than that," Dorothea said. "You were the reason I could be in it." She went out into the March morning. Frances stood at the counter with the small handmade book in both hands and felt something that the winter had been leading toward, a warmth that was not the warmth of the fire or the warmth of the March sun, but the warmth that exists between two people when they have seen each other clearly and found what they saw worthy of care. She read the book that evening, as she had said she would, by the fire, slowly, given each page the attention it deserved. Dorothea wrote with the precision and the care of someone who had spent 22 years choosing words for rooms full of young people who knew the difference between the word that was almost right and the word that was right, and who had, this winter, in the freedom from the school and the marriage and the Islington life, applied that precision to the world immediately around her for the first time. She wrote about the Guildhall in the fog, about the carved beam, about the blackened oak timber, and what it meant that something so old could still be structural, about the church in January, the specific quality of the light through the old glass on a grey morning, the way the colour came not from brightness but from depth, about the snowdrops. She wrote about Frances, with a care and a precision that Frances found, reading it, both accurate and surprising. Accurate because Dorothea had seen things that were true. Surprising because the things she had seen were things Frances did not know she was. The particular quality of stillness she carried into a room, which Dorothea described as not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of deep presence, a stillness that is full rather than empty, that makes the space around it more legible rather than less. The way she listened, which Dorothea described as the listening of someone who receives what is said, rather than processing it, in the way that good cloth receives dye, taking it in fully, without resistance, letting it become part of the fabric. Frances read this twice. She set the book down. She looked at the fire. She thought, she has seen me, in the way that I have tried all my life to see things. This is the gift, not the book, the seeing. She wrote in the notebook, D has given me a book. It is the record of a winter, her winter, though it is also mine. She has seen me in it, the way I try to see things. I have been seen. I did not know how much I needed this until it happened. The witness works both ways. I have been the witness. I have received the witness. The circuit is complete. She closed the notebook. She sat for a long time with the two books, her own and Dorothea's, beside her on the table, their two records of the same winter lying side by side. She thought, this is what a life of attention accumulates. Not only the record, but the other person who is paying the same attention, in the same place, at the same time. She banked the fire and went to bed and slept, for the first time in 11 months, with a complete, unguarded sleep of someone who's entirely at rest. In the last week of March, the lime tree on Church Street came into leaf. Frances saw it on a Monday morning, saw it from halfway down the street, the lime's distinctively heart-shaped leaves in their first small, soft, vivid green. The whole tree transformed overnight from the grey-brown latticework of winter branches into something green and present and entirely spring. She stopped in the middle of Church Street and looked at it. It was, she thought, the moment she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Not the snowdrops. They were the beginning of the waiting, the signal that the waiting would be rewarded. Not the plane tree's buds, nor the elder, nor the crocuses, but the lime, because the lime was always last, the most patient of the Church Street trees, the one that held its winter the longest. And when the lime came into leaf, spring was not coming, spring was here. She stood on the cobblestones and looked at the lime tree for several minutes. Then she walked to Church Street's upper end, to the rooms above the old printer's shop, and knocked on the door. Dorothea opened it. She was wearing her indoor clothes, a pen in her hand. She had been writing. She looked at Frances's face, and at whatever Frances's face was showing, and said, "What is it?" "The lime tree," Frances said. "Come." They walked down Church Street together, and Dorothea stood beside Frances on the cobblestones and looked at the lime tree in its first full spring green, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was entirely right, because the lime tree was the thing that needed to be spoken, and it was speaking for itself. They walked together on the afternoon of the 28th of March. The full route, the route they had walked many times through the winter months, but which was different now, receiving the March afternoon's changed light and the changed village that the light revealed. The crocuses at the priory wall were over. In their place, daffodils, a dozen or more, full and yellow, the particular yellow of early daffodils that is not the warm yellow of summer flowers, but a cooler, cleaner yellow, the yellow of a morning that has decided to be bright. The churchyard's south border had tulip leaves reaching. The elder in the back lane was fully leafed, its green a darker and more settled green than the lime's first tender offering. And the plane tree at the corner of Water Street, the tree that Frances had watched since October, watching it hold its last leaves and then lose them, and then stand through the long winter months in its bare precision, was beginning. Not fully, not yet. 3 or 4 of its large palmate leaves on the southernmost branches, catching the March afternoon light and holding it in the particular way that only fresh spring leaves hold light, translucent and vivid, and entirely committed to the act of being here. They stopped at the plane tree, both of them, without discussion. Frances put her gloved hand on the bark, the same bark she had touched hundreds of times through the winter, but warmer now, or so it seemed, the cold of February gone from it, or reduced to something acceptable, the tree's surface receiving the afternoon sun with a different quality than it had received the winter light. "It is entirely different," Dorothea said. "Every spring," Frances agreed. "Every spring it is entirely different and entirely the same." "That seems impossible." "It is possible," Frances said, "because the sameness is in the tree and the difference is in the light." She took her hand from the bark, or possibly the other way round. "I have been trying to work out which for 30 years. And I think it is both," Frances said. "I think the tree is different and the light is different and the year is different and I am different. And still somehow the tree is the plane tree and the light is the March afternoon light and the year is turning as it always turns and I am the person I have always been." She paused. "And I think that is not a contradiction. I think that is simply what it is to be a continuous thing in a changing world." Dorothea looked at the tree for a long moment. Then she looked at Frances. "I am going to stay," she said, "in Lavenham. I have decided." Frances looked at her. "When did you decide?" "Now," Dorothea said. "But I think I decided in November and have simply been arriving at the decision ever since." The notebook entry for the 28th of March read, "Dat D is staying." She told me this afternoon at the plane tree, and when she said it, I was not surprised. Had not, on reflection, been expecting anything else since at least February. But I was glad in the full and specific way. The confirmation of something hoped for produces gladness. I have been thinking about what this winter has been. It has been, I think, the winter in which I learned that the life I have been living is not as complete as I had believed it to be. This is not a criticism of the life. The life is good. It has always been good. The shop and the weaving and the village and the notebooks and the long satisfying practice of paying attention. It is complete in the way that good cloth is complete. The warp and the weft correct, the tension even, the colour as it should be. But cloth is not the same thing as a coat. A coat requires a wearer. The completion that wears alive is the person who receives it. Edward was that, for 38 years. I had not known until this winter that I was waiting for it again. Had not known that the 11 months since his death had been, in some sense, a waiting, though I was too occupied and too honest to know it as such. Dee is not Edward, she is entirely herself, as everyone must be entirely themselves for the company to be worth anything. But she receives what I offer, and offers what she has, and receives what I offer back. And this circuit, the circuit of two people genuinely present to each other, genuinely attending, is the thing that I have learned again to recognize as the most valuable thing I know how to make. The lane is receiving the spring. The village is receiving the spring. I am receiving the spring. All of it. All of it is enough. She closed the notebook. She looked at the fire, which was smaller tonight. The March warmth made it unnecessary to bank it as high as December and January had required. She thought about Dorothea in the rooms on Church Street, with her 2 cups and her ink-stained fingers and her winter record and her decision. She thought, the world keeps its promises. Then she went to bed, in the sure and patient knowledge that tomorrow morning the bell would strike 6, and she would count the strokes, and rise, and begin. On the first morning of April, Francis Holt woke to the church bell marking 6 o'clock, and lay for a moment in the particular warmth of a spring morning bed, different from the winter morning bed, less enclosed, the air in the room fractionally warmer, the darkness at the window less absolute. She counted the strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She lay and listened to Lavenham waking. The sounds were different from November's sounds. The birds were back, most of them, and the morning had a layered quality that the winter mornings had not, a depth of birdsong that began just before the bell and built through the early hour into something that was not music, but was the quality that music aspires to. Blackbirds primarily. She could hear 3 or 4 of them, in different positions around the village, each singing its own specific version of the blackbird's morning song, the phrases exploratory and returning and exploratory again, the way a conversation works between people who have things to say and also know how to listen. She put her feet on the floor. The floor was the same cold stone floor it had always been, but less cold. The April air in the house had retained enough of the previous day's warmth to take the edge from the morning. She dressed. She went downstairs. She lit the stove, the fire catching with its usual small, bright reliability, and went to the pump in the yard and filled the kettle and returned to the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen window. The garden was green, not the tentative, provisional green of March, the full, committed, decided green of April. The green of a world that has made up its mind. The apple tree in the corner had its leaves and the first, barely visible suggestion of buds that would become blossom in 3 or 4 weeks. She made her tea. She took it to the Windsor chair. She looked at the garden in the April morning light, which was a warm, directional, entirely confident light, the light of a season that no longer needed to announce itself because it was simply and entirely present. She drank her tea. She sat for a long time in the green velvet chair with the morning light on her face and the sounds of the April village around her and the warmth of the cup in both hands, and found the morning as she found every morning she was present enough to receive, entirely and sufficiently itself. At 7:15 she would hear Dorothea's step on the cobblestones outside. She would look up from the chair and see the grey coat passing the window on the way to the baker's. She would not wave. They did not wave. They nodded, which was their established language for this moment. Dorothea would nod, and Frances would nod, and the day would continue. This was enough. This was, in fact, everything. The shop on the first morning of April smelled different from the shop on the first morning of November. This was not something Frances had ever articulated, but it was true, and she knew it in the way she knew all things about the shop, through the accumulated sensation of long familiarity. The November smell was lanolin and wood smoke and the mineral cool of damp stone. The April smell had those things too, but over them and through them was the smell of the April morning itself, coming in through the open door, which Frances left open now in the mornings, because the April air could be let in without cost, the cold no longer in it. The April air smelled of what the garden was doing, and of what the churchyard lime tree was doing, and what all the Lavenham gardens in their various states of spring readiness were doing. Something green and growing and slightly sweet, the smell of the world resuming its full engagement with the business of being alive. Ada came in at 8:30 with the particular brightness of a 17-year-old on a warm April morning, and said with conviction, "Oh, it's properly spring," which Frances found entirely accurate. "It is," Frances agreed. "The marketplace is lovely today," Ada said, taking off her coat. "The pansies in Mrs. Alderton's window box, the horse chestnut behind the Guildhall. Did you see it? All the candles." "I saw it this morning," Frances said. Yes, she had seen it on her walk. The horse chestnut's flower spikes, the candles as Ada called them, just beginning to open, their white-pink cones pointing upward above the large palmate leaves with the same slightly extravagant generosity that horse chestnut flowers always possessed. The quality of a thing that has been waiting all winter to do exactly this and intends to do it completely. The shop's first customer of the morning was a woman from the village she had not seen since the autumn, a farmer's wife from 3 miles out who came to Lavenham quarterly for wool and news, and the particular quality of conversation that the shop provided. "You're looking well, Mrs. Holt," the woman said, with the directness of someone who means what she says. "It has been a good winter," Frances said, which was true in all the ways that mattered. In the second week of April, Frances finished the first skein of the new cloth, the spring cloth she had been planning since January. The colour was a soft, clear green, the green of new growth rather than deep summer, a green that contained within it both the yellow of the light that had produced it and the blue of the April sky. She wound it onto the loom shuttle and sat for a moment before beginning, looking at the empty frame and the new green thread. thinking about what the loom had held through the winter and what it would hold now. She thought about the dark blue and grey cloth, where it had been placed on the shelf, how it had grown thread by thread through the Sunday afternoons, carrying within it every conversation that had happened while it was being made, every silence, every cup of tea, every sentence that had arrived at the right moment. She thought about the fact that the cloth had no memory of these things, and yet was the product of them, that the evenness of its tension and the consistency of its colour were, in some sense, the accumulated expression of the quality of attention that had been present in the room while it was being made. She thought, this is what it means to accumulate, not the deliberate adding of thing to thing. The process by which presence, sustained over time, becomes structure. She set up the new warp on the loom. The green threads were different from the dark ones, more light, more varied, requiring a different quality of attention. She began. On Sunday afternoon, Dorothea arrived and took her place in the chair and looked at the new cloth on the loom. Green, she said. Spring colours, Frances said. It's beautiful, Dorothea said. It's good, Frances said. It might become beautiful. It depends on what happens while it's being made. Dorothea smiled. A full smile, not the quick, precise smile of November, but the fuller, more available smile of a person who has been in the right place for long enough to have found some ease there. Then, she said, settling into the chair with both cups on the shelf above the stove, we had better make it happen well. Frances walked the village in April, as she had walked it in every month, finding what every month offered and finding it as she always found it, sufficient. April's offerings were extravagant by the standards of what had preceded them. The horse-chestnut candles, the churchyard's daffodils in their full yellow abundance, the laburnum in the garden of the house on Water Street, which would, in May, hang its golden chains over the wall and become for 2 or 3 weeks the most beautiful object on the street. But the extravagance of April did not diminish the memory of January. It was not a correction of January, not an apology for it. It was simply what came after, the world's different answer to the same question. She walked up Church Street and stopped at the lime tree and looked up at it, fully leafed now, its April green the roof of the street, filtering the April light and returning it as something both dimmer and richer than what it had been above the canopy. She thought about November, when she had stood in this street and seen the unfamiliar woman looking at the carved beam. She thought about the dark blue wool and the 2 cups and the winter Sundays at the loom and the fog and the snowdrops and the book bound in cloth and tied with dark blue wool. She thought about what it meant to witness a person's arrival in a place, not the physical arrival which was only the beginning, but the deeper arrival, the settling in, the process by which a person and a place begin the long negotiation that ends, if it ends well, in something that might be called belonging. Dorothea belonged to Lavenham now, not completely. A person belonged to the places they had come from as well as the places they had come to, and Dorothea had come from London and from 22 years of the school and from the marriage that had ended and from all the years before those things. She carried all of that with her, as everyone carried everything. But she also belonged here, in the specific, felt sense of having been received by a place and having received it in return. Frances had been part of that reception. She was glad of this. She was, she thought, more than glad. She was grateful in the full sense of the word, grateful in the way that you are grateful for the things that you recognize in retrospect as exactly what was needed and exactly what arrived. She walked home through the April afternoon. On a Sunday morning in the middle of April, Frances and Dorothea walked together to the Sunday service at St. Peter and St. Paul. They had not arranged to walk together. They had met at the bottom of Water Street at the same moment, both on the same route, and fallen into step, as they had fallen into step many times through the winter, naturally, without negotiation, the two paces finding their common rhythm with the ease of things that have had enough practice. The church in April was a different church from the church in December and January, not in its structure, which was immutable, but in its quality. The light through the old stained glass on an April morning was richer than the winter light, more colour, more warmth, the yellows and the reds more vivid, the blues more deeply blue. The flowers on the altar were spring flowers, narcissus and tulips and small white alyssum, and their smell, in the cool interior of the vast stone building, was the smell of spring brought inside to meet the ancient and the permanent, the smell of the new in the presence of the old. They sat in the same pews they had always sat in. Frances in the fourth from the front on the left, Dorothea 2 rows behind, and the service proceeded in the way it always proceeded, the words of the Book of Common Prayer moving through the vast cool air with the quality of things that have been said in this place many hundreds of times and have accumulated through the repetition, a depth that new words cannot possess. Afterward, in the churchyard, Frances paused at Edward's grave, as she always paused, and Dorothea stood a little way off and was simply present, which was, Frances thought, exactly the right thing. The churchyard in April was full of its particular spring beauty. The daffodils in the south border fully open, the new grass of the paths vivid green, the old yews beginning to show their new growth in tiny bright tips at the ends of the dark branches. The sky above it was a complete, uninterrupted April blue. They stood in the churchyard, together in silence for a moment, as they had stood in the churchyard in November. But the silence was different, fuller, less provisional. The silence of people who have arrived somewhere together and know it. The notebook entry for the 15th of April read, "Spring. Fully, completely spring. The loom is 2 weeks into the new cloth. The green is coming well, the tension right, the colour even. Dee sits in the chair on Sundays and watches, and we talk as we have always talked, and the cloth is, I think, going to be the best thing I have made in years. Perhaps the best thing I have made. There is a quality to the work when the conditions are right, when the attention is good and the room is warm and the person in the chair is genuinely present, that shows itself in the finished cloth in ways that only a weaver would recognize, in the evenness and the depth that no amount of deliberate effort can produce. I have been thinking about what this year has been. I will complete the thought here, now, while I have the words for it. This year has been the year in which I understood that the life of attention that I have been living is not only for me. It is not a private practice, a solitary discipline, a form of self-sufficiency that requires nothing from anyone else and offers nothing to anyone else. It is a practice that becomes, if you are fortunate enough, if the right person arrives in the right village, in the right November, a shared thing. Not shared in the sense of divided, as though two people doing a thing together each receive half of it, shared in the sense of multiplied. Two people paying attention to the same things in the same place at the same time. The attention doubles, not halves. The village is more fully itself for having two witnesses. I am more fully myself for being witnessed. Edward was my witness for 38 years. I did not know that I was waiting for another until she appeared at the top of Water Street in a grey coat, looking carefully at a carved beam. I am not waiting any more. The world kept its promise. The spring arrived. She closed the notebook. She put it on the shelf beside the others. She went to make supper, which was a simple thing, and would be made with full attention, and would be entirely sufficient, as all simple things made with full attention are. On the last Sunday of April, the back room held 3 people for the first time. Mrs. Blackwood had asked to see the spring cloth. She was not, she was clear about this, interested in buying anything, which at the age of 80 she no longer needed to do. But she had heard that the cloth was notable, and she was a woman who did not allow hearsay to substitute for direct observation when direct observation was available. She came in at 4 o'clock with the authority of a woman who has been deciding to go places for 80 years and sees no reason to stop. She took the 3rd chair, the kitchen ladder back, the one that had been James Marsh's chair, in a different back room in a different story, a thing it did not know and would never need to know, and sat with her hands on her knees and looked at the loom. "That is a very fine green," she said. "Thank you," Frances said, and kept weaving. "Who are you?" she asked Dorothea, with the directness that 8 decades had bestowed. "Dorothea Marsh," Dorothea said. "I have the rooms on Church Street." "The new woman," Mrs. Blackwood said, in the tone of someone revising a category. The new woman. She had been the new woman since November. By October she would simply be Mrs. Marsh from Church Street, and then, by the following year, simply Marsh, and then, eventually, if she stayed as she intended, if the Lavenham years accumulated as they would, if the patient compression of time did its work, simply part of the village, the way the beams were part of the houses, indistinguishable from the thing they had become part of. "The new woman," Dorothea agreed, without irony. "You'll do," Mrs. Blackwood said, which was her highest form of endorsement, and then applied herself to a cup of tea and the view of the spring cloth and the pleasure of being in a warm room full of women who knew how to be quiet. Frances wove. The green cloth grew. The April afternoon light came through the small window and fell across the loom and across the 3 women and across the 2 cups and the carved bobbin and the small glass vase of daffodils. And the room was warm, and the stove crackled, and the village outside went about its business in the spring afternoon with the unhurried efficiency of a place that has been doing this for 500 years and intends to continue. On the evening of the 30th of April, Frances sat in the leather reading chair with the 18th notebook on her knee and read back through the winter's entries from the beginning. It took her 2 hours. She read slowly, giving each entry the same quality of attention she had given to the writing of it. Not nostalgia, which would have softened the entries into something they were not, but the clear, precise attention of someone reading a record and assessing its accuracy. She found it accurate, more than she had expected. She had thought, reading back from the distance of 6 months, that some of the observations would prove to have been wishful or overstated or arrived at through the distortion of loneliness, looking for what it needed rather than seeing what was there. But they were not. The observations about Dorothea, the steadiness of the hands, the quality of attention she brought to things, the gradual slowing of the pace, the ink stain, the 2 cups, were all accurate. The process she had observed had been real. She read the February entry about witnessing. She read the March entry about the word companion. She read the April entries, which were lighter in tone, which was appropriate. The spring had the right to be lighter than the winter. And then she read the January entry that had taken her longest to write, and that she had revised 3 times before she was satisfied. The witness works both ways. I have been the witness. I have received the witness. The circuit is complete. She set the notebook down. She looked at the fire. The fire was small. The April evening had not needed much of it. In a few weeks, it would not be lit at all in the evenings. The house warm enough through the April and May days to hold its warmth through the nights. This was a passage she always noticed. The first evening, the fire was not lit, which arrived with the same gentle certainty as every other passage in the year, preceded by days of smaller fires, and then by the simple absence of the need for one. She thought about all the fires she had sat beside in this room, all the evenings, all the notebooks, all the mornings, from the same bed and the same window and the same kettle on the same stove. She thought, this is my life, all of it, the accumulated presence of all these days and all these attentions. This is what I have made. She thought, it is enough. It is in fact more than enough. She thought, it is everything. On the first morning of May, Frances Holt woke to the church bell marking 6 o'clock and lay for a moment listening to the morning. The morning was different from November's morning, entirely different in its sounds and its quality of light, though it was the same room and the same bed and the same bell, counting the same hours. The birds were in full voice, not the tentative, rebuilding songs of early spring, but the full-throated chorus of a Suffolk May morning, which was one of the most complex and layered and genuinely beautiful sounds she knew. The whole air filled with it from the first light. The blackbirds and the song thrushes and the robins and the blue tits and the chaffinches, each contributing their part to something that was, in its totality, far more than the sum of those parts. She counted the strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She lay and listened for a long time. Then she rose and dressed and went downstairs and lit the stove. Though the May morning did not require a fire, she lit it anyway, because the ritual was not about warmth, but about beginning, and went to the pump in the yard and filled the kettle and came back inside. She stood at the kitchen window. The garden was entirely green and entirely alive. The apple tree was in blossom, white flowers with the faintest trace of pink at their edges, the whole tree trembling slightly in the May morning breeze, its blossom catching the early light in the way that only apple blossom catches early light, each petal slightly translucent, the light coming through from behind. She looked at the apple blossom for a long time. Then she made her tea. She sat in the Windsor chair. She held the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through her palms. And she looked at the May morning, and the May morning looked back. At 7:15, she heard Dorothea's step on the cobblestones. She looked up from the chair and saw the grey coat. Lighter grey today, the summer coat, the May coat, passing the window on the way to the baker's. Dorothea's head turned as she passed. Their eyes met through the glass. They nodded. The day continued. The village of Lavenham on a May morning is one of the most quietly beautiful places in England. The timber-framed houses receive the May light differently from how they receive any other light. The ochre and cream and pink of the plaster warmer, richer, more fully themselves in the long, warm mornings of May than at any other time of year. The carved beams are still and dark and patient, as they have been for 500 years and will continue to be for 500 more. The cobblestone streets, warmed now by the May sun, are dry and golden in the morning hours, and the sound of boots on them has a different quality from the sound of boots in November. Lighter, less emphatic, the warmth of the stone having softened something. The church of St. Peter and St. Paul stands at the top of Church Street, immense and patient, and entirely itself, its tower visible from the edges of the flat Suffolk fields for 10 miles in every direction, its interior cool and vast and full of the accumulated presence of 500 years of Sunday mornings, and the words that have been said in it, and the people who have said them, and the people who have heard them, and the quality of attention that a building so old and so thoroughly used for the same purpose accumulates over the centuries into something that is less like atmosphere and more like substance. The marketplace on a May morning has its own particular life. The baker with his trays, the blacksmith already working at the far end, the pansies in the window boxes of the houses that face the square, the Guildhall's cream plaster luminous in the morning sun, and along Water Street, past the plane tree in its full May leaf, past the shop with its shutters just opening, past the small glass of flowers in the back room and the 2 cups on the shelf, and the loom with its growing length of spring green cloth. Along this street, at this hour, the world is doing what it has always done. The village exists. The morning light is real. The bell counts the hours with complete impartiality, as it has counted them for 500 years, making no distinction between the hours that contain happiness and the hours that contain grief, and the hours that contain, simply, the ongoing fact of a life being lived with attention and care. Frances Holt is real, even though she never lived. Dorothea Marsh is real, even though she never came. The friendship between them is real, even though it was never spoken. Because the light through the old glass in April is real, because the January frost on the cobblestones is real, because the snowdrops at the base of the priory wall appear every February in the south-facing soil and are witnessed, whether or not there is anyone to write them down. Because Lavenham exists and has existed and will continue to exist, and every morning the bell counts the hours, and the hours are sufficient, and the world continues. And now, dear listener, the morning light is fading from the marketplace, the way light fades from all things when the story that contains them comes to its end. Not disappearing, but becoming interior, becoming part of what you carry. You have been in Lavenham through a full winter. You have walked Water Street in the November grey and the December frost and the January fog and the February clarity and the first March warmth. You have sat in the back room of the wool shop with the stove and the loom and the 2 cups on the shelf. You have been in the church on Sunday mornings and in the churchyard where the snowdrops appeared in February in the south-facing bank below the priory wall. You have heard the bell count the hours, 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and all the hours between. The village is real. The light on the carved timber beams is real. The blackbird in the lime tree on a May morning is real. These things were here before Frances Holt and Dorothea Marsh, and will be here after them, receiving each season with a patient, unhurried acceptance of things that have been doing this for a very long time. The friendship is real too, even though it was made of words. It is real in the way that the best things are real. Not verifiably, not objectively, but felt. You have felt it. It was there in the warmth of the back room, and the 2 cups and the cloth growing thread by thread on the loom, and it was as true as the frost and the spring blossom and the church bell marking the hours. Let the village become quiet now. Let the marketplace empty. Let the shutters go up on the wool shop. Let the fire in the back room burn down to its last warm coal. Let the loom stand still in the evening, the green cloth half finished, waiting for Sunday. Let your breathing slow to the pace of the village in winter, the pace of the January lane when the fog has settled and the world has reduced itself to what is immediately and essentially here. Let the thoughts come down the way the November leaves came down, individually, turning slowly, each one settling among the others without urgency. There is nothing you need to attend to now. The church bell has counted this hour, and the next hour will be counted in its time. The loom is waiting. The spring cloth will be finished on Sunday. The cups are on the shelf. The carved bobbin is on the shelf beside them. Lavenham is quiet in the evening, quiet in the way that old places are quiet, a quiet that is not empty but full, a quiet that contains 500 years of mornings and all the people who woke to them and counted the bell and rose and began. You are here, dear listener. You are in the warm room at the end of the day that required your full attention and received it. Let your body be heavy now. The pleasant heaviness of a long walk completed, of a day fully inhabited, of a person who has been genuinely present in a real place for the full length of a winter. Let your eyes close. Let the village continue without you for a time. It will. It does. It always has. The bell will count the midnight and the 3 o'clock and the 6 o'clock dawn without requiring anything from you. Let yourself go slowly toward the rest that is already here, that has been here, that has been waiting in the warm dark, the way the snowdrops wait under the soil all through the long frost, certain of what they will do when the time arrives, asking nothing from the waiting but the waiting itself. The fire is low. The loom is still. The bell has counted this hour, and you, dear listener, are very nearly there. Sleep now. The wool shop is closed. The street is quiet. The church is keeping the dark with the patience of 500 years of practice. And somewhere on Church Street, 2 cups are washed and on the shelf, and the spring cloth is half finished on the loom. And tomorrow there will be a morning, and the bell will count it, and the world will continue, and Frances Holt will stand at the kitchen window with her tea and the May light will be on the apple blossom, and everything will be as it always is, entirely itself. Let go. Sleep. The village is keeping you.